G'day, mate. 40 here. So I love the Netflix TV show American Primeval, which I was discussing yesterday. And one of the things that I love about it is its accurate and chilling portrayal of what is called the state of nature. And that's what happens in the natural world when there is not a strong government. And Jews in particular fear a lack of strong government because there's a traditional teaching in the Mishnah, the oral Torah, which preceded the Talmud. So there's a teaching from over 2,000 years ago by leading rabbis that says, instructs Jews, and this is a Jewish practice, pray for the welfare of the Gentile government, right? Because without it, men will swallow each other alive. And so that's the Hobbesian view, that without a strong government, life will be nasty, brutish, and short. And you see that just brought to such like a keen, chilling detail in this Netflix TV show, American Primeval. I'm also watching the Mayor of Kingstown, just another great show from Taylor Sheridan about a mythical small town in Michigan where there are about 7 major penitentiaries, and it illustrates another major theme of the show is that our identities are porous. All right, what's going on with you affects me. All right, what's going on my street affects me. And in dangerous environments, all right, I will lead a much more conservative life. That in multicultural Los Angeles, people tend to go to work and largely isolate themselves from the wider city and just spend time with themselves, with their own group, and with watching TV. While when you have a city that is much more homogeneous, such as Salt Lake City, then you have a lot more volunteering. You have people much more willing to get out there and participate in wider society. So Taylor Sheridan, all of his major TV shows, so Yellowstone, Mayor of Kingstown, Landman, Tulsa King, and then his movies, Sicario 2, worth a watch. All right, this is from Mark Halperin a few minutes ago.
I got to say, I couldn't agree with you more. I don't know for sure the origins of the virus, but I know that there's plenty of reasons to be open to the story. And what could be a bigger story than the country with whom we're in an existential struggle for supremacy in the world through their actions, potentially destroyed millions of lives and trillions of dollars and brought the world to our heart, ruined the education arc of many children, at least in the short term. I mean, and how my colleagues in the media couldn't jump on this as the story of the century. How they could not jump on it, I do not understand. I do not understand. Now, unfortunately, I can give you partial reason, which is Trump derangement syndrome.
Yeah.
Donald Trump, the minute the notion was it came from the lab rather than the wet market. The minute that became a Trump idea, the press said, "Well, that can't be true. We're not gonna talk about that." This is, I talk about how the cover up of the loss of Joe Biden's mental acuity is the biggest media story in, I think, American history. Really think it's the biggest media story in American history. This is a pretty big media story, but it's also just a big story. And I will never understand. And I would love to bring on the editors of the news division presidents of the 10 major mainstream media, dominant media organizations, and ask them, how could you not have thrown every reporter you have at this story? The New York Times covers the It Ends With Us movie controversy more than they covered this practically. It's just crazy. Ryan, am I going overboard?
No, that's such a great analogy about This Is Us. I could not care less about a story that gets large attention than that story about the movie. But I do know more about it than I care to know because it constantly covers it. You're right about that. Yeah.
Particularly in the Times. The Times is very invested.
Yes, they are. Well, they're being sued. So
yeah. Well, they were invested before that. Mike, I wish I had a better answer for you, but I will tell you this, and this happens with with weapons of mass destruction. It happened with Russia, which is for the media to acknowledge its failures would require an unprecedented level of self-reflection and public acknowledgement of professional malpractice. It's a lot to ask of an organization or an industry to say, we screwed this up. And if they were doing it honestly, they'd say, here's why we screwed it up. There's simply no justification for the failure, which persists to this day, as it does, by the way, on the cover up of the Biden mental acuity laws, persists to this day. Failure to cover it and to throw resources at it and to write editorials condemning the Chinese. You just don't see it, and I can't explain it to you. But Mike, you're right to raise it. I appreciate you raising it. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming in. All right, let's get one more in. Remember, we're ending early tonight because.
All right, some good points there by Mark Halperin on the news media. All right, let's get the beginning of Laura Ingraham.
In the ongoing robed resistance to the Trump agenda. Now, this case involving a case that could have profound implications for our military readiness and cohesion. Now, first, a little background. Now, recall that Joe Biden had issued an executive order allowing openly trans people to serve in our military, which, of course, emboldened the activist.
We must set our sights higher and focus on intentional inclusivity for all of you out there. I ask you to set out your symbols of pride, share your pronouns in your email, particularly if you're a person who doesn't think they need to. Initiate difficult conversations about racial and gender barriers, and share a bit of your vulnerability in a way that draws others in.
Yeah, because we spend $890 billion on our military to showcase our vulnerability. Anyway, Trump rescinded Biden's trans order and issued his own, effectively barring transgender service personnel from being in the U.S. Military, noting in part that the armed forces have been afflicted with radical gender ideology to appease activists unconcerned with the requirements of military service, like physical and mental health, selflessness, and unit cohesion. And it went on to conclude that expressing a false gender identity divergent from an individual's sex cannot satisfy the rigorous standards necessary for military service. Adoption of a gender identity inconsistent with an individual's self conflicts with the soldier's commitment to an honorable, truthful, and disciplined lifestyle. And it goes on and on. Well, what happened at that point? Well, they went crazy. Keep scrolling, kids. I don't need to read the whole thing. Well, 2 LGBTQ organizations filed suit in federal court to enjoin the Trump order, and the hearing was today. Now, right off the bat, the judge in this case, Ana Cecilia Reyes, revealed her bias, taking extreme umbrage at the use of the words gender ideology in the Trump EO, and argued that the entire order is just basically an attack on trans people's character, saying this is a policy of the President of the United States affecting thousands of people. To call an entire group of people liars who have no integrity, how is that other than showing animus, she said. Well, throughout the hearing today, she sounded more like a lawyer for the plaintiffs than an impartial jurist, saying, if you were in a foxhole, you wouldn't care about their gender ideology, right? She went on to suggest that the DOJ lawyer would be happy with someone that of the plaintiff's commendations, fighting right alongside him. Now, at one point, she literally made the DOJ lawyer sit down in an attempt to prove her point, equating someone's alma mater with gender dysphoria, saying, what if I said no one who graduated from UVA Law School can argue before me? I guess he went to UVA, as I did. Sit down, she said to him. Well, he stood there, and she said, go sit down. Then she brought him back up and said something along the lines of, did you see how unfair that is? Of course, this is ludicrous. The bottom line is the president is the commander-in-chief, and it is well within his Article 2 rights to make determinations regarding readiness and fitness for service. Now, we know what happened.
Okay, where do we know the name of the Delta pilot? I mean, the cause of the crash seems pretty doggone clear. All right, so look at the Delta accident. Look at the smooth landing. Look at the contrast. Okay, the nose doesn't tilt up.
Oh fuck! Oh fuck! Oh no 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 no!
Okay, now notice by contrast a smooth landing.
03 with you on the ILS at 5. Just 803, Vancouver Tower, wind 0 at 12, clear to land, runway left. Line left, just 03.
So normally a plane tilts up as it's coming into land. So this has got to look like pilot error. I don't know what the hell happened. Delta accident versus smooth landing. So the pilot did not flare the plane, meaning slightly pull back on the stick so the nose of the aircraft lifts. The plane enters at an angle. As you can see in the proper landing, the second landing that we showed, this naturally decreases speed because the plane is showing more surface up front, increasing wind resistance. If you don't flare the plane, you land horizontally without the nose up, as you can see in the accident. Right, that's way too much stress on the landing gear. Right, and it's like jogging when you're 58. I'm 58. I don't do much jogging anymore because you better have great collective tissue if you want to start jogging, because jogging puts a lot of stress on your connecting tissue. And the more you have weird interfering tension patterns, right, the heavier your footprint. And so the more likely you are to get into trouble. So the Delta plane's landing gear collapsed under the force. The plane hit the runway flat and then rolled over several times. It's a miracle everyone survived. So here's a pinned video on Delta's TikTok account. So regardless of whether it's a DEI pilot or not, Delta has long been a major advocate for DEI, and you don't get DEI without reducing standards and without reducing quality. So who was the doggone pilot of this Delta flight, right? So video shows no usual flare of the jet where the pilot pulls the nose up just before landing to slow the plane down. Big pilot error, puts tremendous weight on the landing gear, which appears to have collapsed. So doesn't seem that difficult to understand why this plane crashed. Here we go.
Has snow, and it's a huge jet. When I heard regional jet, I thought small. No, it's a huge jet. And fire when the wheels touch down, or so it looks, followed by a cloud of black smoke. It's very clear. I don't know why this guy was filming this particular landing, but man, he got the whole thing. It went on its side. It then flipped upside down, and somehow everyone survived. So, Wiz, how does this happen?
Well, Megan, thanks for having me back again. Sadly, under these circumstances, or actually since everybody got out, I guess we're okay. Megan, the first thing, when I saw the in-cockpit video this morning, I heard you reading your email in the last block there. Then I guess I can talk like this. That jet was coming down like a turd off a tall moose. Landing in F-18 aboard an aircraft carrier, our average rate of descent is about 800 feet per minute. And I think the last flight tracker data that I saw for this RJ was about 1,100 feet per minute. So that RJ came down a lot faster and harder than I would have landed aboard the boat. And I think, you know, one of the officials yesterday or last night said, hey, crosswind wasn't an issue. Whenever anything like this happens, Megan, I grab my aviation app and I immediately look at the weather, see what the weather is. And landing on runway 23, the winds were out at 270, so about 40 degrees off the nose.
Okay, I'm pretty sure we're going to find it was pilot error. All right, here's leading vaccinologist Paul Offit. He says Anthony Fauci agreed that only high-risk groups should get the COVID-19 vaccine, but then he proceeded to overrule scientists. He recommended universal vaccination because he believed that Americans could not handle the scientific nuance.
In February of 2022, I was asked with 3 other immunology virology types to participate in a conference call about whether or not natural infection should count as a vaccine. In other words, for those areas that were still mandating vaccine, which was many in early 2022, whether they should be able to say, look, here, I was naturally infected here. This should serve as my vaccine card. And that meeting was held with Rochelle Walensky, Tony Fauci, Vivek Murthy from Surgeon General's office, and Francis Collins. And then me and 3 other immunology virology types. So he started off, he said, oh, let's introduce ourselves. So, Tony Fauci says, I'm Dr. Tony Fauci from NIID. And then Rochelle Walensky says, I'm Rochelle Walensky from CDC. I said, we know who you are. And the question is, who the hell are we, right? Yeah, they probably didn't need to introduce themselves. In any case, so we voted on it, and it was sort of 2-2, basically. I mean, I was one of I think natural infection should count for obvious reasons. I mean, actually, you're making an immune response off 4 viral proteins. You, in many ways, make a broader cytotoxic T-cell response. I think you're better off in many ways. The problem with natural infection is it's misnamed. It should be called survivor-induced immunity because not everybody lives with a natural infection. So,
yeah,
that was. I wish we had then immediately gone to the press and said, "Look, here's the conversation we just had. Here's the conversation that we went back and forth on this." Because while we all basically agreed, I think that it should count. That the question was bureaucratically, would it work at a time when people could just go on the internet and say, "Look, I've been naturally infected," and get out of it. It's just. It became more of a bureaucratic issue. So I saw Dr. Fauci at a meeting maybe a year ago or so, because I was already getting out there saying I think we should target high-risk groups, where I was getting a lot of pushback from public health people who felt that I had gotten off the bus. Because, see, that was the whole feeling in this. You're either on the bus or off the bus, and there was no in between. So I'd gotten off the bus. I said, Tony, am I wrong? Am I wrong in making it? He said, no, you're right. We should target high-risk groups. He said, the problem is, the minute you say that, it becomes a nuanced message. And a nuanced message is a garbled message. If you really want to make sure those groups get vaccinated, then you recommend it for everybody. And okay, so if we think that, we should say it. Because my personal thinking on this is, then if that's the reason we're vaccinating healthy 16-year-old boys, that's not a good reason. And just have it open. Say it openly. You know what I'm saying? Because I think people are smart enough to hear it.
Okay, so I went and read his latest book. Right, it's called You Bet Your Life, From Blood Transfusions to Mass Vaccination, The Long and Risky History of Medical Innovation. And this is how he concludes his book. Number 1, nature reveals its secrets slowly, grudgingly, and often with a human price. So scientists, academicians, pharmaceutical company execs must stay humble, respect the requisite learning curve that comes with new discovery. So his book came out in the fall of 2021. The development of COVID-19 vaccines was often accompanied by a disturbing show of hubris. And so he argues that this lack of humility was especially concerning given that SARS-CoV-2 had already shown itself to be an elusive, difficult to characterize virus that had provided a number of surprising clinical and pathological problems, not least of which was inflammation of the blood vessels that could damage any organ, including the brain and the heart. And a learning curve lay ahead. So I went and looked up how many deaths in the United States can be attributed to COVID vaccines. And from a report in 2024, up to about 57 possible deaths due to COVID vaccines. His other concluding point is, although government guidelines lessen the chance of disasters, they will never eliminate them, right? No matter how much regulation, no matter how many training programs, fines, and penalties are put in place. But 3, tragedy shouldn't cause people to lose faith in the scientific endeavor. Science lurches forward in fits and starts, but it inevitably moves forward. Then he talks about the Qatar incident. So 100,000 children in the 1950s were inoculated with a polio vaccine that contained live polio virus. Tens of thousands of children were briefly paralyzed. Hundreds of kids were permanently paralyzed, and 10 were killed. Then federal regulators shut down the program for several months until they could figure out what went wrong. When they finally figured it out and they had better safety tests put in place, right, then they resumed vaccinating people. And overwhelmingly, after that, getting the Jonas Salk polio vaccine was far superior to not getting vaccinated. So a few months after the Qatar tragedy, polio vaccines were put back on the market. Parents had a choice to make. They could either trust that federal regulatory agencies had solved the problem, or they could wait a year to make sure the problem didn't recur. But the choice to wait without a vaccine, that is not risk-free either, because polio virus was still circulating in the community. It's animal testing can be falsely reassuring. In the end, no matter how well informed you are about a new technology, you're always going to be gambling. Whether you take advantage of the new technology or you avoid the new technology, either way, you are making a gamble. And I've been reading the 1995 book by Richard Rhodes, Dark Sun, The Making of the Hydrogen Bomb. And Lavrentiy Beria was an incredibly effective bureaucrat under Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union, but after World War II, he was incredibly vulnerable, right? If you watch the movie The Death of Stalin, right, Beria is the man in the first half of the movie. He's got everyone else frightened to death, right? But after World War II, he was in a vulnerable state because he'd been assigned a vital project that had been given the highest priority of the state, but he lacked the knowledge necessary to judge its progress. Think about the United States. We spent $2 billion in 1940s billions, when $1 billion was really $1 billion, to create the nuclear program, and yet none of our politicians and very few, if any, of our leading military experts understood whether we were making progress with nuclear weapons. So we threw the equivalent of hundreds of billions of dollars at creating nuclear weapons. And the people who are dispensing the funds and the people who are checking up on the scientists, right, they're not really equipped usually to judge the expertise and the advance of the science. So Beria, like most politicians, like most of us, he lacked the knowledge necessary to judge the Soviets' nuclear program. He was at the mercy of scientists, intellectuals, and all sorts of people that he viscerally distrusted. And we're all at other people's mercy all the time. Right? You drive down the road, you're at other people's mercy, that they decide not to collide with you. Watch American Primeval or Mayor of Kingstown and just have a visceral sense of how often we're at other people's mercy. So with all of Beria's power, right, he understood nothing about physics. He was silent when the subject came around to uranium, plutonium, the separation of isotopes. And so he was trying to understand and keep tabs on something that he didn't understand. So he developed ways to decrease his vulnerability. He sent security officers to Japan to film the destruction of Nagasaki. He developed a stable of backup scientists with fewer Jews among them, whom he might call upon to replace the number one team if that team proved to be treacherous. So you think the President of the United States just has awesome power, or Lavrentiy Beria has awesome power. But the President of the United States, while allocating the equivalent of hundreds of billions of dollars in today's terms, he didn't know whether our nuclear program was going to succeed. And Lavrentiy Beria didn't understand the nuclear program. Think how vulnerable the Soviet Union felt at the end of World War II until they were able to launch their own nuclear program. So just when the Soviet Union began a crash program to build its own atomic bomb, the American nuclear program came to a grinding halt. So basically by September 1945, the American nuclear program was wound up, and everybody just wanted to get out. If the atomic bomb had shocked the Japanese, it also shocked America. Right? It seemed a mysterious and supernatural force. It was a new fact dropped into the world. No one knew what to do with it. And the scientists who worked on the bomb also emerged from secrecy and found it necessary to explain themselves. So who's really in charge? It's not the scientists. It's not the politicians. It's not the military. It's the situation that's in charge. Right? Change the situation, and right, you have a completely different set of people who will be wielding power.
The recruiting numbers since Biden waved transgendered persons into the military. They cratered. And we know the anger in the trans world is real about this and other rules regarding, for instance, the use of restrooms and locker rooms.
If you say that you're afraid of Trump and that's why you don't want the city to be a safe space for trans people, you better prepare for trans people to make this a very unsafe space.
So, who is this Judge Anna Reyes? Well, in short, she's a dedicated left-wing activist. Before law school, Reyes signed up to work for a group called Feminist Majority, which argued unsuccessfully against Prop 209 in California, which banned affirmative action in government hiring. So in other words, she's for discrimination against, let's say, white males if it would benefit a minority. Now, Judge Reyes, like so many activists, is a product of Harvard Law School. And while a partner at the very prestigious firm of Williams & Connolly, she did pro bono work to help asylum seekers and refugee organizations, including she worked for something called the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies. She also challenged the first Trump administration's restrictions on refugees entering the U.S. through ports of entry. Now, only Dick Durbin, by the way, showed up at her confirmation hearing. And of course, both of their top priority is not the well-being of American citizens, but the fast-tracking of fraudulent asylum seekers.
Do you have any idea what percentage of those who come to our border seeking asylum or refugee status and go into the process are actually approved to stay in the United States?
A vast majority of the individuals who pass the credible fear interview do go on to become asylees. They do ultimately get asylum through the court process.
Oh, goody. Oh, goody. They'll get asylum. Now, every profile of Ms. Reyes points out that she's the first Hispanic woman and openly LGBTQ person to serve as a district court judge in Washington, D.C. Now, could the DOJ have argued for her recusal in this case, given her background or obvious anti-Trump bias? Probably, but it doesn't really matter much because in the end, the Supreme Court's going to have to determine whether being gender dysphoric is a protected status for the purposes of U.S. military service. So buckle up. All right, DOGE once again doing what our elected officials should have done years ago, safeguarding our hard-earned tax dollars and auditing the bureaucrats who spend it. Well, if you were one of the silly few who bought the narrative that the illegals pouring into the country add value to our economy, well, this may change your mind. It turns out in 2023, the Biden administration shelled out $10 billion to set up the welcome wagon for illegals. And in 2024, it was another $4 billion out of HHS. That's just HHS, by the way. But all of that is chicken feed compared to the other surprise the DOGE crew found, a nearly untraceable budget line item payment of $4.7 trillion. What? Wait, Virginia voters, they have to be very, very happy that their new congressman is upset, not with the obscene levels of waste, but with how DOGE is actually discovering the waste.
DOGE, I call it the Department of Government Inefficiencies, is causing a reign of terror, chaos across the federal government. I have a major, major concern about them going into Department of Defense and futzing around with, the internal systems there and U.S. national security.
So one way that people may feel safer in a frequently unsafe world is to imagine, hey, at least we live in a republic, we live in a democracy, we don't live in a dictatorship. But as I've been hammering on for years, we live at times and in places and in situations according to a constitutional dictatorship. All right, so the normal political playbook for presidents in the United States is to say, we have an emergency, therefore I need these powers to deal with this emergency, and presidential power, right, grows ever larger. So what George W. Bush did after 9/11 essentially just played according to the standard script, right? He announced the existence of a new emergency, threatens the nation's survival, asked Congress for new powers to deal with it, and Congress replied eagerly, right? Passed the Patriot Act, reorganized government agencies, consolidated intelligence services, created a new Department of Homeland Security. And so Bush's actions matched the traditional pattern for American presidents. First, he declares a crisis or an emergency. And when you state there's a crisis or an emergency, then you can take away all sorts of rights that people had come to believe were just inevitable. But as we saw during COVID, the rights can be just taken away. Now, Bush also tried to grab additional emergency powers without asking for congressional approval in 3 areas. So his detention and interrogation, his creation of military commissions, and his secret domestic surveillance program. So this was his greatest mistake, and this is the source of his most ardent criticism. So Bush lost momentum because he didn't deal effectively with an emergency Katrina. He lost momentum. He received criticism because he deviated from the traditional script for American presidents seeking emergency authority. So Donald Trump is not deviating from the script so far. He's essentially, not explicitly saying we're in an emergency, but he's essentially saying we're in an emergency, we're spending way too much money, and so we have to allow the Doge boys to get in there and do something unprecedented to reduce our spending. So in Bush's second term, he seemed to learn some lessons from his first term. So he convinced Congress to pass a bunch of legislation. But he lost momentum because he didn't effectively deal with the emergence of Hurricane Katrina, and he didn't effectively deal with the insurgency in Iraq. Now, President Truman, for the first time, he sent American troops into action overseas in the Korea War without getting congressional authorization. He tried to nationalize America's steel mills to support the Korean War, and the Supreme Court pushed him back on that. So Truman forever changed the powers of the American presidency, but not the basic pattern of America's constitutional dictatorship. So this dictatorial power is dispersed in the modern administrative state. If a policeman arrests you, he essentially has dictatorial power. And then think about Ben Bernanke when he was chairman of the Federal Reserve. Right? He said a central bank should base its policies as much as possible on consistent principles rather than just seat-of-the-pants judgment. But when the economy melted down in 2008 and a recession and a depression appeared inevitable, Ben Bernanke started inventing policy on the fly. Right? He just threw out the rule book and did all sorts of unprecedented things. So Ben Bernanke was the Schmittian sovereign, right? The sovereign is the person who can successfully define something as a crisis and then do whatever he thinks is necessary to meet the crisis. Now, Ben Bernanke is not a sovereign dictator. He is a constitutional or commissarial dictator. He enjoys his powers courtesy of a congressional statute. And the United States has a Federal Reserve Bank with just unprecedented powers compared to other reserve banks and other advanced economies. So the discretion that Ben Bernanke exercises, right, his power did not rest with the president. Right? It rested with Ben Bernanke, who just started inventing things on the fly. We had a crisis, and it was not George W. Bush who was playing the role of the decider. So our modern political system will often face complicated problems that call for substantial expertise, and the people who normally have the power often do not understand, do not have the expertise. And so how do you govern in a democracy when only a tiny number of people have even the requisite amount of expertise to judge what the experts are saying? So our modern political administrative state completely overthrows conventional understandings of a dictator as just one single strong man at the top who makes key decisions. Again, it's the situation who creates the strong man. The 2008 global financial crash created a strong man in Ben Bernanke. So in California, we have a public health official at every county who has the power to shut down everything in that county, to enter any building to deal with a public health crisis. So in the economic crisis of 2008, President Bush was a figurehead. Right? It was the Treasury Secretary and the Chairman of the Federal Reserve who made the key decisions. Probably wondering what's going on with the commentary crew.
It's been, in my reckoning, since I basically had my first child almost 21 years ago, has been in the works.
Another example of how many of us feel helpless in the face of expertise.
For 21 years. It's about the American Academy of Pediatrics, which sounds like a very official, wonderful organization, and bringing together all pediatricians to do pediatrician things and say pediatrician things and give you advice and provide you with the guidance that you want when you're, particularly if you're a first-time parent. Seth now has 3 kids. Christine has 2 kids. I have 3. Seth has 6 kids, excuse me. Christine has 2. I have 3. And when you're your first kid and you don't know what the hell you're doing, and you look things up and it says, well, the American Academy of Pediatrics says this and the American Academy of Pediatrics says that. And so at the time when I had my first kid in 2004, the American Academy of Pediatrics said, no screens for 2 years. Do not let your kid look at a screen, watch TV. This is before the iPad. Don't give them your phone. There weren't even iPhones yet. No screens, no TVs. Very bad for brain development. Terrible. This had the net effect of sort of making you, anytime you put on the TV and your kid was looking at you, felt guilty. If you felt guilty, you're doing something bad to your kid's brain. Over time, as your kids age, or you are like living in a world and you see what other people do, or you're just not like fanatical about things, you let that slide and you understand that maybe you need a break for 20 minutes. So you put on some, little show for kids, you still feel guilty. Like, it's essentially designed in the classic way that these things are designed to say, don't do anything, so that maybe you'll do half of it and then you'll be better than just being totally laissez-faire. So that was my first experience at the American Academy of Pediatrics, and things have gotten worse from there over the last 20 years as it's become clear that the American Academy of Pediatrics is essentially a liberal, leftist, social organization, the purpose of which is to use their standing with neurotic parents to advance an extraordinarily politicized agenda.
Yes, I mean their motto really should be often in error, never in doubt. I think the example of the screen time was something they did for a while, which is get out ahead of themselves, ahead of the research, and make rather dramatic statements, and then they'd have to roll those back a few years later when the evidence was coming in. I mean, that was the one recommendation I was kind of on board with because I hate screens for little kids, but they were wrong on the evidence. So that the whole point is that parents go to that organization to see what they assume what the general opinion of most pediatricians is. And that's where, as parents, we should no longer do that. I love my kid's pediatrician. She's fantastic. Most parents do love their kids' pediatricians. But this organization has become a social justice organization. We saw it first with transgender medicine, where they completely went full on board in absolute direct opposition to the evidence of the harms caused to children, embraced that. We've seen it during COVID, where they, after initially being thoughtful and making recommendations about kids coming back to school, when then first-term President Donald Trump said, oh, yes, this is a good idea. Let's get kids back in the classroom. They pivoted. They changed their recommendation, suggesting that perhaps it wasn't as scientific as we think, because they didn't want to be allied with President Trump. And they worked instead with the teachers unions who kept schools closed in this country for far too long. Same thing with masking. So that they have this it's not caution. It's caution with this very heavy overlay of left-leaning ideology. It's finally come to fruition in their treatment of, and you might be surprised to learn that a pediatricians organization has strong views on the Middle East, but they've come out in support of Hamas, literally someone who is a general in Hamas who also happened to be a pediatrician, calling for his release, and never mentioning, for example, all the children held hostage by Hamas, or the fact that it was a terrorist organization. So that was sort of the final straw for me, seeing them dabble in foreign policy and doing it so badly. I think what it shows is that a lot of these professional institutions have over time relied on the credibility of their many times excellent members, pediatricians who do the work day to day of helping America's children, but they should no longer be trusted. It's trust but verify with these sort of medical organizations, these medical institutions. Many of them have been infected by ideology. So I think what's useful for parents is to make sure that they're hearing directly from their pediatrician what the medical advice is, and not looking to these recommendations, which get picked up in the media and written about a lot, without double checking with their pediatricians, because the organization, the AAP, has unfortunately become an ideological group.
And of course, this is true basically of most nonprofits that represent professions that people go to work for them permanently. It's not they're not working as pediatricians. They're working as activists or as lobbyists or some version of a combination of the two. And from pediatrics to nuclear, the thing when I was a kid was the nuclear scientists putting out the bulletin of the atomic scientists, who were basically wanted to enshrine the numerical superiority of Soviet nuclear warheads by every time the U.S. or NATO made moves to really defensive moves to.
So good challenges about when expertise leans left.
They call it like Trump derangement syndrome. It was like they got shot with a dart in the jugular that contained like methamphetamine and rabies, okay? And they're like, wow.
Why can't we all just get along?
All of these agencies are like big fat chickens dripping over barbecues of fat.
You think Democrats are afraid to talk to Trump voters?
I think Democrats are afraid to talk to Trump voters. I think Democrats are afraid to talk to people that are going to criticize them.
If you can't take the heat, get out of the kitchen.
We envision this as a place where residents and visitors from all over the world come together and restore the promise of the People's Park.
Obama's library is a DEI disaster.
Obama out.
Plus,
I said over easy!
Democrats don't believe Trump when he says DOGE is finding fraud. They say he doesn't have any evidence. Well, today, the president brought receipts.
$520 million for a consultant on the environment. $25 million to promote biodiversity, conservation, and promote licit livelihoods by developing socially responsible behavior in the country of Colombia. Well, it's nice, $25 million to go into Colombia for something that nobody ever heard. $40 million to improve the social and economic inclusion of sedentary migrants, $19 million for biodiversity conservation in Nepal, $1.5 million for voter confidence. We want to give them confidence in Liberia, $47 million for improving learning outcomes in Asia. Asia's doing very well. They're doing a lot better than we do in the schools, aren't they?
$500 million for an environmental consultant. I am in the wrong business. We're sending $50 million to schools in Asia while we shut down schools in America. Like W said, is our children learning? Call 911. I'd like to report a murder.
I understand that even a temporary interruption in federal employment is a great crisis and catastrophe for you and for CNN. What the American people see is a government that is finally delivering a promise of accountability under President Trump. You want to have a conversation about transparency. Let me ask you a question. Do you have any idea where the $22 billion that the Department of Health and Human Services provided to illegal aliens under Joe Biden is right now? $22 billion with a B. That's enough to provide a free house to every homeless veteran in America. Where's the $22 billion? I don't know. You don't know. Nobody knows. Joe Biden just spent it, and now it's gone.
Once your money hits Washington, it turns into a ghost. Poof, it just disappears. DOGE says they found almost $5 trillion in payments that are untraceable. The budget line is blank, and they're worried about your Bitcoin. $5 trillion, untraceable. No idea where it went and how it was spent. A $5 trillion blank check. Social Security sent out $72 billion in bad checks. Guess who resigned last night? The head of Social Security. Right when DOGE asked Michelle King to have a seat because she was about to get canned, she says, "You can't fire me because I quit." And the press is acting like this isn't suspicious.
You may assert there's no waste in the Pentagon. You may assert there's no waste in
Stephen,
Treasury.
I'm not
you may assert there's no waste in
HHS.
Stephen,
I don't think anyone...
Then why are you not celebrating these cuts? If you agree there is waste, if you agree there is abuse, if you agree there is corruption, why are you not celebrating the cuts, the reforms that are being instituted? Every day that no action is taken, the entire salaries of American workers that are taxed disappear forever.
Stephen, let's calm down.
This is
We're not having a debate
there's no reason
about whether there are
places...
places...
You are clearly trying to debate me, and I will be as excited as I want to be about the fact that we are saving Americans billions of dollars.
If loving Stephen Miller is a crime, lock me up. DOGE says they've already saved $55 billion of your money. $55 billion. So instead of putting that money back into the Treasury, Trump should give it back to the taxpayers. We should be getting DOGE dividend checks. He can even sign them if he wants to. I know he likes to sign them. If Trump was running for re-election, he'd win in a landslide. And these aren't stimmy checks, like where we printed money and mailed them out. These are savings, costs us nothing. It's a dividend payment that Americans deserve. We'll take the billions being spent on migrant DEI and sex changes for Cambodian climate psychiatrists and just give the money back to the people. How could anybody be against that? How could Democrats fight that? Giving hardworking families rebate checks from DOGE savings. Mr. Wonderful says, whack harder.
I think the issue is they're not whacking enough. There's this concept in private equity when you get a bankrupt company and you go in there, you cut 20% more than your initial read. And then you find like a pool of mercury, the organization gels back together again. Always cut deeper, harder when there's fat and waste. All of these agencies are like big fat chickens dripping over barbecues of fat. This is the best barbecue I've ever seen, but I don't think it's happening fast enough. They're not cutting enough. Keep slashing, keep hacking while you have a 24-month mandate before the midterms. Cut, 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 cut. More cutting.
If you're running a business and your CFO lost $1 trillion in the first quarter, you'd fire him. If you ask the guy in accounting, what'd you write the $1 million check for? And he can't tell you, you fire him. If $1 billion went to build something and 10 years later by the site and it's still a vacant lot, you fire everybody. It's common sense. But these bureaucrats and politicians have never run a business. When they need money, they tax it. And when that's not enough, they print it. And when they screw up people, they instead hire people. The worse they do, the more money they get. It's the opposite of how the real world works.
America's in shock that the guy whose catchphrase was "you're fired" is firing everybody in government.
They're surprised that two billionaires who build things for a living know how to run a business and are applying business principles to running the government.
This DOGE, I call it the Department of Government Inefficiencies, is causing a reign of terror, chaos across the federal government. They have access to the American people's personal information, bank accounts and things like that, that they're frankly not entitled to. And so I have a major concern about them going into Department of Defense and futzing around with the internal systems there and U.S. national security.
The Pentagon lost $6 billion in Ukraine. Maybe the internal systems need a little more fussing around with. What the fuss, Vindman? When people...
Okay, let's get Michael back onto the show. How's it going, Michael? Michael, are you there, buddy? Michael, you need to...
Yeah, sorry about that.
Hey, no problem. How's it going, man?
Good. So what are we talking about?
Let's do a little bit more about American Primeval. So if you were to describe the show to someone, like what type of person would you recommend it to, or how would you describe the show American Primeval?
Okay. Well, like we were saying last time, I thought it was almost entering into the genre of horror. It was so graphic that but at the same time it was a period piece. It was something for people interested in history. So I would recommend it to pretty much anyone.
Okay. And how did it affect you? Like for me, it was, wow, this is such a sharp portrayal of life without the state, right? Without some ordering, civilizing power that is keeping us safe, right? This is what life looks like. But were you inspired to any philosophical contemplation?
No. I was, it got me interested in the history of it, and I think that anytime a series or a documentary makes you want to go read about it, then I think that that it's successful. So, I read up on the history of what exactly was Brigham Young up to then, and what exactly was the beginnings of Mormonism. Were they as diabolical as they were portrayed in that show? And I mean, I think Mormons have a kind of a PR problem probably based on their kind of eccentric beliefs.
And do you believe Mormons are Christians?
I don't know. I mean, I think that's a claim that Christians might make. I'm not really religious, so I wouldn't really have a dog in that fight. I don't have a god in that fight.
Right. Okay. And then there was a terrific Netflix documentary on O.J. Simpson. What stood out to you in that Netflix series?
Yeah. So this is where we got cut off last time. Excuse me. Well, first of all, the first episode it has a lot with Mark Furman. And if you think about it, Mark Furman has been kind of normalized in the last decade. I don't know if you noticed this, but he's been on Fox News kind of doing commentary. Not a lot, but like at some point He was. And, despite his unsavory statements that he might have made, he is, he's telegenic, he's articulate and all that. But anyway, the first episode, he just describes how he arrived at the scene. It was not supposed to be his shift, but he was called to go there, and he's kind of just discovering evidence and trying to put things together. And I think it makes it pretty implausible that he was behind a conspiracy to implicate OJ in the murder, seeing as that, like, he didn't choose to even be there. That's the ironic part.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the evidence that O.J. Simpson was guilty was just overwhelming, and you really have to, if you're not black, you really have to get out of your own life experience and really work to establish some empathy for why overwhelmingly the American black community celebrated his not guilty verdict, because the American black community has a very different experience of life and of the police than you do and I do, right? I overwhelmingly look at the police as the good guys. And I look at the evidence, it's overwhelming that O.J. Simpson was guilty, but I bet it's not a lot of fun being a small minority in the United States, and a minority where you can't hide, right? So Jews, they don't necessarily come across as Jewish unless they choose to explicitly, wear a certain garb or speak a certain way. But Jews, many other groups can assimilate, like plenty of people from the Middle East, from Afghanistan, from Pakistan, can pass as white. Barack Obama could have just passed as an ordinary American if he didn't want to build a career out of his part black identity. So it was such a dramatic manifestation of two very different experiences of life that came out of the O.J. Simpson not guilty verdict. Any thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah. Yes, 100%. So the problem, though, is that while I agree with everything you just said, a lot of times it's implied, and it is implied in that documentary at some point, that, well, you have to look at the context, and it was Rodney King, and therefore, there was these racial injustices, and therefore it was looked at as justice. I think that's it's a bizarre way to look at it, because when you're judging the case, it's like he's either guilty or he's not. The context of society is irrelevant. Whether you murder two people, it hardly is related to Rodney King. I don't think O.J. Simpson was thinking about Rodney King, was he?
No, but most of your fellow Americans who are black, according to polls, had a completely different reaction to the verdict. So you are perfectly free to say, I am not going to expend the effort to empathize with why they experienced the verdict in such a different manner from everybody else. But I would say it would behoove the thoughtful person to understand that different groups experience life differently. And so you think it's just it should just be settled on the basis of the evidence, but that is not how life is experienced for a lot of people. For most people in the world, it's not a matter of evidence, it's a matter of whom. Like, who is doing what to whom. And you may have these notions of universal morality, but this is not the dominant perspective in the world. For most people, it's just a matter of whom. Who is doing what to whom, and for black Americans, it was the white man was doing something to their man, and so they sided with their man, which is how most of the world operates, right? Most of the world has dual morality, where there's one morality for how we treat members of our in-group, but not much care or consideration for how we treat members of an out-group. And so the victims were not black. The victims were white, and they overwhelmingly experienced it through that tribal lens. Anything you want to say?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm not so naive as to suggest otherwise, but I guess the question is that, granted that it definitely broke upon racial lines in terms of how people saw the case. The question is, were they happy because they thought he was innocent, or were they happy because it was just a win, even though they knew he was guilty? And also, just to add the caveat that you did have, you had an African-American lawyer on the prosecution, Christopher Darden, who
was a terrible, terrible, terrible lawyer.
Yeah, you think so? Was he? Yeah, I don't know, but he does a good job, at least in the documentary, in explaining his perspective. And I was quite young during the actual case, so I've just read about it, but I like the fact that at least this guy, he's like, yeah, I looked at the evidence and he was obviously guilty, and he had to deal with the social pressure because he's expected not to be on the prosecution, and he's expected to show racial solidarity, but meanwhile he's just like, I'm looking at the evidence. And the same with OJ had a friend that testified against him too, another African-American guy. So it kind of makes you appreciate it more, doesn't it?
Well, he wanted all the benefits of being the big man on this big case, but he didn't want any of the price, right? But all benefits come with a price, right? He operated in a disastrous fashion when he insisted that O.J. Simpson try out the glove. You never, ever try anything in court where you don't already know the answer. And he was put forward because he was black. He was not among the top 100 prosecutors, right?
Right.
He was solely put forward because he was black, but he wants to deny that. The prosecuting team wants to deny that. Everyone knows that he was solely put forward because he was black, and there's a price for that. Right, you want to benefit from affirmative action, right? You want to benefit from working the system, right? You want to get ahead through working the system, then there's a price to be paid. But people, they just want all the advantages of working the system, but they don't want to pay any price, right? He rightly, will go down in history as someone who contributed to bungling the trial, played a huge role in bungling the trial, and he was only there because he was black. He was not there because he was among the top 100 top prosecutors in that department. And so you see the opportunity to play a big role in a big case. Well, there's going to be a price to pay. You're not going to get that amount of fame, all right, and not expect a downside.
Right. Well, I mean, first of all, I'm against affirmative action. I'm with you there. However, I didn't get the sense like he even volunteered. I think he kind of reluctantly accepted. And yeah, I do think he was chosen for his race, but I think that kind of just happens all the time in a trial. You're like, okay, who's going to connect with the jury? Like, let's put a woman in here. I mean, I feel you, but I don't really apply that sentiment to him in particular, because I think that, as I said, he was chosen for pragmatic reasons, but I don't think that he wanted to take advantage of the situation in some kind of craven way. I think he just kind of got in there and did his best, which, I'll defer to you if you say he did a bad job. But I think he comes off good in the documentary at any rate.
So there was a UCLA professor who analyzed affirmative action entrance into medical schools, and it turns out that the average test scores of blacks who are admitted to medical school in the United States, their test scores are lower than the average scores for whites and Asians who are rejected. And so 7 out of 8 blacks who get into medical school in the United States require substantial amounts of affirmative action. And so I could understand why people would want to take advantage of this opportunity, but this creates the reality of, you go see a black doctor, and if you don't know anything else, right, the odds are about 85% that this person has required substantial amounts of affirmative action. Do you want an affirmative action doctor? Do you want an affirmative action lawyer? Do you want an affirmative action accountant? Right? Do you want to rest your life or your well-being in the hands of someone who has substantially benefited from affirmative action? And now 10-15% of the time people did not depend on affirmative action, but the reality is, because the statistics say about 85% of the time, if you're a black in an American medical school, you have substantially benefited from affirmative action. That places all black doctors under a pall of suspicion unless there's overwhelming evidence to the contrary, and that's unfair to the 15% who didn't require affirmative action, but that's the reality, because the way life works, we don't have time to make a lot of nuanced decisions, right? It just takes too much processing power, so people are just going to automatically have a great amount of suspicion when there are groups that substantially benefit from affirmative action. Any thoughts?
No, I get it. Trust me. Like I know all the arguments, and we'll see if things change with the Supreme Court decision. But getting back to OJ, I'm kind of on the same topic. It's funny that Johnny Cochran's team knew that when the jury was overwhelmingly African American, he's like, clearly that's a good thing for us. But Marcia Clark was naive enough to think it was good for her.
Yeah, she was an idiot. And again, she was not the best and the brightest. She was pretty good, but she was an idiot in that she thought that sex would be more powerful than race. And there are times when sex is more powerful than race, but in that situation, race was obviously far more powerful than sex. So Marcia Clark was thrilled to get women on the jury, but black women, right, they weren't going to vote to convict O.J. Simpson. I served on a jury, and there were 2 blacks on the jury. We were judging a man who had an obvious blood alcohol content that violated the law, just astronomical blood alcohol content. But according to the 2 blacks on the jury, 2 black women on the jury, we already have enough black men in prison, so they were not going to vote to convict no matter the evidence. And so the Anglo-Saxon judicial system of trial by jury works for certain people, but it doesn't work so well in a tribal society. So it used to be when you first had Jewish immigrants or other types of immigrants, all right, they were much less likely to vote to convict one of their own. We, in the United States, we have an Anglo-Saxon judicial and political system, but it can be easily abused by those who have a far more tribal outlook. Any thoughts?
Well, and if that sounds untoward, I just point you to the fact that Johnny Cochran himself were like, okay, this is good for us. So they had a preference, so they're obviously aware of this dynamic as well.
Yeah. I mean, they understood reality more clearly. The case was decided once the LADA shifted the case from Santa Monica to downtown, right? If they'd held the trial in Santa Monica with that kind of demographic, right, overwhelmingly likely that O.J. Simpson would have been found guilty in the criminal trial. Once they shifted it to downtown, they made it verging on the impossible to convict him.
Right, and according to the documentary, the prosecution did so because they were scared that if he were convicted by a white jury that there would be riots. So they kind of just acquiesced up front.
Yeah, which is a consideration. So let's say he was convicted and then there were riots that took the lives of 100 people and caused $50 billion worth of damage. Right? It's not just to shift the system so that you make it easier for him to get off, but it's probably better for society, right, to have O.J. Simpson declared not guilty in a criminal trial and skip the riots.
Yeah. Maybe that's what they. I mean, they pretty much said as much. So, but then you had, you had an unjust outcome, obviously. But and here's another thing I thought was interesting. So Mark Furman, the show kind of becomes about him. The trial becomes about is Mark Furman racist rather than did OJ commit murder?
Yes.
And then he decides to plead the fifth because he had to get his own attorney, and he realized that he might have had some legal exposure, and so he just found it in his interest to plead the fifth. However, the defense took advantage of that, and they asked him, "So, did you plant the evidence?" And then he had to say, I plead the fifth, and so the jury was not savvy enough to understand that there's other reasons to plead the fifth besides you're guilty. They were not sophisticated enough to understand that. So they took that as to literally mean, oh my God, he did plant evidence because he won't just say no. But when you plead the fifth, then I guess you have to keep doing it to every single question. So,
and according to Furman, the prosecutor's office stopped talking to him, right?
Yeah.
So he was being called back. And if I were Furman, And according to what I know, I would say, yes, I did not use the N-word. I was not thinking in terms of a dramatic performance where I was trying to help out a writer friend create an exciting TV show or an exciting movie. And so I was acting out a character, an actor, right, who says the N-word is not the same as a regular bloke who says the N-word. So I would have thought that he would have had a defensible position. And the prosecutors just cut him off. They didn't talk to him. They didn't prep him.
Yeah.
They didn't return his calls. And so that screwed Mark Fuhrman. And in return, I think he made a really bad choice to just plead the fifth.
Yeah, and I'm actually confused about whether, was it just in the context of that screenplay, or were there a lot of people that came out and said, oh, yeah, he was like dropping that word left and right?
Yeah, I'm not sure. In the documentary, it seems to only talk about it in the context of the screenplay.
Because that is a little different.
Yeah, it's completely different.
But I just, in 93, during the case, it was like Mark Fuhrman was like the devil. That was just in just the cultural awareness that was the vibe that you picked up. But anyway, what else? Oh, okay. Here's Cato Kalin. OJ let Cato stay at his bungalow, and so it's funny because Cato kind of owed him a favor, but hiding a double murder was a little bit too steep of a price to pay back for crashing at his house, I guess.
Yeah. And then I didn't get why they didn't use the woman who saw OJ driving crazily. And I don't sympathize with the American tendency to denigrate those who receive payment for telling their story. Marsha Clark was getting paid, right? She made millions off this trial. Christopher Dodd made millions off this trial. The defense attorneys, made bank off this trial. Thousands of people made money from this trial. But this one particular witness who saw O.J. Simpson driving in a crazy way immediately after the murders, and because she tells her story to Inside Edition and gets paid for it, I don't see why that makes her any less credible. That's crazy, right? Credibility depends upon the accuracy and the lack of impeachability of what you have to say, whether or not you're paid for it. So I think it's outrageous that somehow a person who testifies without payment, without ever being paid, is somehow regarded as more righteous or more credible than someone who is paid, because thousands of people were getting paid from the O.J. Simpson trial. Why is it that only some people getting paid, that's cool, but this poor woman, all right, who's being besieged by the news media, and she takes $10,000, to me that doesn't diminish her credibility. Her credibility rests on the accuracy of what she has to say and whether what she has to say can be impeached, and no one has effectively impeached what she had to say. So if I speak to the New York Times and I don't get paid, that doesn't make what I have to say ipso facto more credible than if I speak to the National Enquirer and they pay me $10,000. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I believed her. She really had no reason to make it up, although the defense would say she made it up to get paid. But yeah, I mean, obviously. And the defense team, the ones who were in the documentary, so Johnny Cochran's assistant, and he was pretty revolting guy, but doing his job, just he's not gonna 20 years later say, oh no, actually I think he was guilty. I guess that would be unprofessional. So you have to say that. And Alan Dershowitz too, right? Alan Dershowitz never said OJ is guilty. He just, if he references it, he will just kind of make the case that there was not sufficient evidence or whatever. But even the experts, like the DNA experts they had on their team, the one in particular in that documentary, oh my God, he was just such a shyster. Like, it was, I just found him so revolting, because here he is, a scientist, and he knows OJ was guilty.
Yeah.
So did you find that guy revolting?
Probably. Yeah. I mean, I found the jury most revolting of all. I found the LA District Attorney who chose the downtown site most revolting of all. I found Marsha Clark's and Christopher Darden's mistakes incredibly revolting. And so if you're getting paid to be a defense attorney, like I give you something of a break. So for example, I dated a woman. She was an economist. She was very much a free market economist, but she worked for an entertainment group that lobbied for subsidies from the state government because that was the job that was available, right? You don't always get to choose your ideal job. And so if you go to work and work requires you to say, for example, when someone calls for the boss, that the boss is not in, he's in a meeting, when he just simply doesn't want to take the call, right? Yes, you're telling a lie, but you're doing your job. And so when people are doing their job, like I'll cut them a break. You know, I recognize that we have an adversarial system, and so I wasn't consumed with hatred for the defense team.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, that's why it's kind of a conflicted emotion, because on one hand I feel like you're lying and that's dishonorable, but it's also I suppose the scientific expert, they're paid for their scientific expertise to testify on behalf of the defense, and that's a whole racket too, right? So
yeah, well, it's a living. So there are experts who typically testify for plaintiffs, and there are experts who typically testify for defendants, and then there are some experts who are mixed. There are experts who are willing to go to greater lengths to get those expert fees than other experts. So yeah, it's complicated. But if you're willing to lie to collect your fees, it is distasteful. Mm-hmm. But it is also the system that we've set up. Like, I don't like the jury system. Like, after my experience on the jury system, I don't like it. I would prefer one judge or three judges. I think the jury system may well have served us in a different United States of America. But what works for one particular people is not going to work for a different people. We're a different people now than we were at the end of the 18th century and in the 19th century. So we might have to. I mean, I don't think that the jury system works sufficiently well anymore. I'd like something different, such as I'd be fine with three judges or one judge.
Something, yeah. I don't think it works. And you just look at the 19th century. Just look at how people spoke back then. I mean, there was just apparently of a higher moral and intellectual quality. I know that's kind of a trite thing people say, and people argue it both ways, but just look at how they wrote and look at how they spoke. And don't tell me there's not something that we've lost something.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, quality of life was just overwhelmingly better in the 1950s. Like, probably 1950s, early 1960s was peak America. I mean, that was the highest quality of black family life, right? That was probably the closest that the blacks and whites came to high quality family life, and you didn't have to lock your car. Usually, you didn't have to lock your home. That we had much more social cohesion and social trust, and all that just started getting torn down in the 1960s.
Yeah, but I kind of like your riff when you kind of play devil's advocate, that for those conservatives, those curmudgeons that think everything is worse and it's getting worse, I like how you tend to disagree with that in a way.
Yeah, I recognize that, yes, quality of life, overall quality of life, the overall sense of social cohesion and social trust much higher in the 1950s, but I lack patience for those who can only wax lyrical about the past and only crap on the present. Right? There are ways that life is better now than it was in the 1950s, and just that blinkered view of the past was great and the present sucks. Yeah. I don't have any patience for that.
Well, and I think your show has a positive message, because what you're saying to people, what you're saying to conservatives and people on the right wing is that you have to, although you don't necessarily use these words, is you have to find a way to fit into the world as it is, and you have to try to have a good life, even though, there's policies you don't like and there's changes you don't like. I mean, I kind of just give up on social cohesion in 1950s. It's like, I'm just trying to enjoy life as it is right now. But trust me, I get the arguments. I get it, but it's just not, it's as I guess you would say, it's not an adaptive mindset to just constantly be looking around and saying, I hate this, I hate everyone, so that's not how in some ways I don't even, I have conservative views, but I don't really live my life like a conservative, and I don't think you do either. Although you are an Orthodox Jew, that's pretty conservative. But
I live in Los Angeles. I sometimes ride the bus, sometimes ride the subway. I go to writer gatherings that are incredibly racially, religiously diverse.
Yeah,
and move fairly happily through that.
Yes, yeah, same. I think we're both. It's a different thing to be like a cosmopolitan conservative than like a rural conservative. So and there's not really too many of us either.
So how do you spend your intellectual time? Do you primarily spend it reading books? Do you primarily spend it reading newspapers, listening to podcasts? That time that you set aside for thinking about the news and ideas, how do you divide it up?
Wow. I would say that I used to read physical books a hell of a lot more than I do now, but I always make a point to read at least a little bit of a book every day. But then when it comes to the news, I consume a lot of news. I've always been a news junkie, and that's kind of my point of interest, I guess. So I read news online. I don't really subscribe to any newspapers. I just kind of randomly. I would say lately I like to read the hard news, just what is actually happening. Like, I don't want to hear anyone's take on it,
Yeah.
Especially because I feel like there's good news. So I think like you, I'm kind of bored by conservative media a lot. I think you might actually like it more than me, judging by, your
selection of clips.
Yeah, and which is cool because then it's like otherwise I would never hear what's going on Fox News actually. But there's really I'm interested in your take. There isn't any conservative writer, or maybe there's a couple, but there's not a lot where I feel like, oh, let me check out. Oh, he has a new piece. We got to read this. We got to get his take. I think, as you said, Tucker Carlson used to be the man with his monologues, but now it's long form interviews, so it's not quite as immediate, is it?
Well, I need to read everything by Christopher Caldwell.
I need to read something by him.
Yeah, I need to read everything by Christopher Caldwell. Yeah. I need to read everything by Steve Saylor, and I need to read everything by Charles Murray.
Yeah.
And I can't think. Then we go to academia. I have to read everything by a philosopher of the social sciences named Stephen Turner. So he's an academic. So I have a handful of people that I have to read everything that they have to say. But if there's no conservative thinker that you have to read everything they have to say, who would come closest?
Well, okay, so there's no one like that. But I'll just tell you, conservative writers I've enjoyed, and I've recently started enjoying Josh Hammer. Are you familiar with him?
Yes, I know Josh Hammer, yeah.
And he might come off like as another, strident conservative voice, but he's a great writer. He's very, I always feel like I learn something when I read his columns, and then it kind of takes me on a different path and I learn more. And he's a young guy. He's like in his 30s. So I think Josh Hammer is a great writer. Ann Coulter is very talented. But we're talking about writing. Ann Coulter is a good writer. Like you can read her writing and laugh. She's funny in writing, and that's something I can appreciate. But when it comes to like the New York Post editorial of this conservative with here's why Biden is awful and Democrat, I'm just so bored by that,
Yeah. Now, let's talk about Ashley St. Clair. So I've been following her probably since 2018, and she has done an excellent job of curating the photos that she presents of herself. So if you just go by the photos that she's posted of herself, she's 10 out of 10. I like her presentation of herself online. It wasn't until this Elon Musk debacle. This was the first time that I was disconcerted by anything that she'd said online. So I enjoy her edgy, MAGA perspectives infused with the wit and wisdom of a beautiful young woman. So I've only had positive experiences from following Ashley St. Clair on social media. I haven't put a great premium on her perspectives, but I just enjoy them, enjoy her. I think it's wonderful to see someone who's beautiful and young fighting the good fight. I agree with almost everything that she fights for. And yet, I haven't wanted to look too closely at underneath the image, and so I don't like the trend to just try to destroy every beautiful quote unquote e-thought, every beautiful young woman saying right-wing commentary and amassing a huge following. She must be a slag underneath. So I didn't pay much attention to all the people who were taking it down. But now with her tweet about Elon Musk as the father of her baby and why isn't he reaching out to her, she seems to have justified the critics of her who I've always ignored. And I think there was a pretty good piece in the Daily Mail. Elon Musk, 26-year-old, alleged 26, so somewhere between 26 and 31, baby mom Ashley St. Clair, furiously went public about their child because Elon ghosted her on Valentine's Day, her acquaintance claims. Seems like she wasn't getting what she wanted, was emotional and hurt on Valentine's Day, decided to parade her crazy on the front porch, thinking people would be sympathetic to her as a victim of a powerful, wealthy man. Ashley paraded her crazy on the front porch and invited the media to capture it. Mum was just throwing a temper tantrum because she was trying to elicit a reaction from Dad. It appears that she was upset about some photo of Elon on Valentine's Day with another woman. Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. And
who wrote that?
This was in the Daily Mail, and it was by the Trump activist Kylie Kramer.
Okay, I was going to say, that's written by a woman, I'm going to say, because that's very nasty. Oh, my God.
It is nasty, but have you heard of something called abductive reasoning? That's reasoning to the simplest, best explanation. It's how detective stories work. And if you're trying to just reason this incident to the simplest, best explanation, she seems to cut to it, right? Abductive reasoning, simplest, best explanation. Yeah. She went nuts after Valentine's Day. What's your thought?
I was just thinking, I don't think they would have let a man write that just with the tone of it.
Right.
So I kind of just surmised that it was written by a female. I think I just don't understand why I would be angry. Now, first of all, I kind of agree with your assessment of her in physically and in terms of her commentary, that her pictures are gorgeous. And then when you see her talk, it's like now she's just, she's still attractive, but yeah, there's a big gap there. And I've never been super offended by her, but I've never seen her say anything that I thought, oh, that's a good take. That was some original thinking. So I put her in that category, kind of like Lauren Southern, that I don't know. I don't want to be a jealous hater, because I have 300 followers and she has 30,000 or 300,000 on Twitter, but I don't get it. I don't get why certain people have such a huge following, and then maybe it's because she's a woman, but what, am I going to be mad at that? I mean, that's just how it is. But now that when she tweeted something at Elon, like, why don't you recognize me? I mean, that's kind of a very vulnerable moment. So why would I kick her while she's down? And I mean, I'm sure she can lick her wounds in her $30,000 apartment in the financial district, though.
Yeah. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on her. I'm not going to be trashing her. I think she behaved in a trashy way. She made it impossible to ignore her. She's not someone that I've talked about on the show, and I'm going to move on after this. But she, to the extent that she feels miserable because of online reaction, this is entirely self-created, right? There's absolutely no necessity of her acting out the way she did, and as a result, I would expect she feels pretty miserable right now.
Oh, yeah, I don't know. I don't know how she feels. I kind of assumed that she was like happy for the attention, but I wouldn't know. And by the way, I'm the person that broke the story of her age inconsistency.
Oh, okay.
I'm the man that broke that story. That was my. Usually, no one cares what I say on Twitter. Like they extremely don't care what I say, but I was, I myself was, cutting some videos on YouTube about the topic, or just one. I think one is enough. And so I was reading the New York Post articles pretty carefully, and New York Post had like 7 articles about it in one day, which is kind of funny. It's like a perfect New York Post story.
Yeah.
And so I myself was kind of writing my little script, and I remember reading that she was 31, and I thought, okay, that's pretty young. 31, and that makes sense. She can have a baby pretty easily. And then I read a later article the same day, and it said Ashley St. Clair, 26. And I'm like, hold up, 26? Now that's really young. So I had to go back and kind of find the article I read first and Google it and find the link that was purple because I already opened it. And yeah, so the New York Post in the same day published 2 different ages. And I didn't mean it to say that she's a liar, that she lied about her age. I just literally don't understand. I was like, what the hell's going on? How old is she? I don't know. Maybe it's a mistake on the New York Post, but don't you think that's bizarre that they would post 2 different ages on the same day?
Well, it is, number one. Number two, the New York Post has always been the least reliable form of major news media in the United States.
Oh, wow.
So it doesn't have a great track record for reliability. Really? Yeah, I mean, compared to the New York Daily News, compared to the New York Times or any other major newspaper in the United States, the New York Post is probably the worst as far as fact checking.
Yeah, I'm willing to believe that.
It's a trash tabloid.
Right.
Not that it doesn't sometimes have interesting things to say, but it lives in the gutter.
Yeah, I mean, I like the New York Post, to be clear. I'm not against them in any way, but I would concede that they probably don't have as big an operation as like the Washington Post. But they are, however, definitely above like the conservative websites, like way above in terms of, I would imagine, their process, like their editorial process, because they're paying actual salaries to writers and editors. So it is kind of surprising to catch them with a mistake like that, or like you wouldn't really find a typo in the New York Post too often, right?
I don't know. I don't read it very much, so I wasn't surprised when you talked about 2631. Like, I got a friend who reads it all the time. I only read it when I absolutely have to. First of all, navigating the New York Post website is awful. Oh. It's just a horrible experience.
But there's no paywall, so you have to accept it. Although, okay, I can think of one other typo or grammar mistake I read in the New York Post. They used the word censorious incorrectly. Censorious does not mean censoring a lot. Did you know that? You're kind of a wordsmith, right?
Yeah, somewhat, yeah.
So censorious means that someone who would censor others, like, or censure others, not censor. Yeah. In other words, censorious is someone who would like harshly criticize other people. But so many people use censorious as to refer to the adjective form describing someone or something that censors, and that's not what it means. Isn't that crazy?
Okay.
So I wrote about that in my blog, and they reference it on like Wikipedia or Wiki something.
Okay. So out of everything that you've published, is there one thing, whether it's on social media or for the Daily Caller or the Federalist, is there one thing that you're best known for?
I don't think I'm known for anything. Well, I think, okay, I did have Trump refer to a couple of my articles, though. Trump, I published just a very pro-Trump article in 2015, and Trump tweeted it out.
Wow!
And he kind of gave me a shout out, so that was cool. And that was really before people were on the Trump train, to be honest. So I get annoyed when people who were not, like, commentators. So there was that, and then there was an article I talked about De Sanctimonious, and I was kind of analyzing why does De Sanctimonious apply to DeSantis, and I kind of broke that down, and it was very popular on my blog. I don't care about my blog, but that was very popular. And then I wrote another piece on De Sanctimonious for Daily Caller, which was picked up by the Trump team at the time. That was during the primary. So that, I guess those would be the more high profile.
So when did you think that Donald Trump was a possible next president of the United States? So for me, it happened in early August when he was at a rally, I think in Arkansas, and Jeff Sessions came up and introduced him.
Yeah.
And I saw that in something like early August of 2015, and I got the chills somehow watching it. And I never watch politicians. I like listening to politicians talk. For me, is excruciating because it's usually so bland. And for some reason, I thought I should watch a Trump rally. And then I said, whoa, there's something here. So was there a moment when you realized there is something special about this man? He could be the next president.
Oh, I mean, 2012, actually. In 2012, he was that was the birther stuff, that was just so audacious, I mean, I believe, Obama was born in Hawaii, if that's what he says. But yeah, 2012. But then when he dropped out, I was a huge Romney supporter. I was very excited about Romney. So I think we're a little different, because I have to admit that I have been in the past, like, feeling very heavily invested in just Republican politics. I was very excited about George W. Bush in 2000. I remember that one. In Romney in 2012, and Trump. I remember the 2016 primary, and I was for Trump 100% during that. But I remember they were trying to push Scott Walker as this very exciting, dynamic guy. And they're like, did you hear this Scott Walker speech? Look at how he rolled up his sleeves and he's speaking loudly. But whereas Trump had these spontaneous moments and energizing crowds and gathering crowds in ways that were unexpected, now that we take it for granted. So I thought there was something special, and I said so at the time, and Trump heard me and he appreciated it. And, so, and now he has haters on the right wing too, which I think is ridiculous. But again, that's why I like your show. You're not so far out there that you're shooting yourself in the foot.
Right. I'm not wedded to Donald Trump. I'm generally aligned with him in that I support immigration restriction, and I support reorienting America's trade policy in the best interests of American workers. And I am for no more forever wars. So the three biggest things that he stands for, I stand for also. But he is so embarrassing at times. He acts like a toddler at times. He seems to lack discipline at times. He seems to be such a over-the-top narcissist at times. So it doesn't bother me that other people will have contempt for him. I think many criticisms of him are fair. But I've never been so deeply invested in Trump that I couldn't see criticisms of him. And I've never been so deeply invested in Trump that I ever thought he was going to do everything that he said. For me, if he just would do 5-10% of what he had to say, what he had to promise, that's great.
Yeah, exactly.
So I've never been disillusioned by Trump, except perhaps after the 2020 election. I thought his claims about how the election was stolen were reprehensible and without evidence, and that he had set the foundation for an event like January 6th, and that he had shaken the faith in America's political system for tens of millions of Americans. And I thought that was horrific, what he did. And I could understand why many people would just regard Donald Trump as disqualified from holding higher office after that abysmal behavior.
Yes, but getting back to what you said about his narcissism, but here's the thing, though. He himself is like in on the joke, you know? Like
Yes.
He himself knows it, and so he has a sense of humor about it. And in a way, he's self-deprecating because he knows that he acts ridiculous. And so, yeah, anyone who's a well-read person is not going to find him like super eloquent. But he's funny, you know. So, but yeah, I agree that you have to have an independence of judgment, and you can't be on the Trump train like just shilling for everything. I mean, I disagree with some stuff too, and I sometimes disagree with things he says. Yeah, absolutely. But
now,
thank God
how humbled are you by your George W. Bush support? I am humbled because in retrospect, he was a disaster for this country. He was a terrible president. He might well be the worst president we've ever had. Certainly invading Iraq in 2003 was the biggest gamble taken by any president of the United States ever. And I voted for him twice. And because I couldn't, I only vote Republican, but I feel humbled by what a terrible president he was. Do you feel humbled that you were all enthused about George W. Bush, and you don't feel humbled by what a horrible president he was?
Not really. I mean, for one thing, I was like 20 years old when I voted for him in 2000 or 19. And for another thing, what he said on the campaign was, I still find to be quite sensible. It's just that he did the opposite when he was a president. So I think the George W. Bush, the candidate in 2000, was like kind of Trump. I mean, he was saying similar stuff. Maybe he was kind of more free market stuff, but he was anti-war. He was isolationist. He was common sense, and he also just came out like, I mean, it is kind of funny to think back that it wasn't just me. People loved him in 2000. People loved him. They were very psyched about, and the battle of the election in 2000. I'm sure you remember the controversy.
Yes. I was psyched about him up through 2005.
I did not vote for him in 2004. I was off.
You didn't? Really?
No.
Why?
I think, well, look at John Kerry's campaign. What John Kerry was saying sounded much more reasonable. He sounded more protectionist. He sounded more anti-war, less interventionist. So I just kind of agreed with his policies more at that time. And I didn't vote in 2008. I didn't like McCain. I didn't like Obama. So that's my voting history, 40.
Okay, so John Mearsheimer says that Biden administration's interference with Ukraine is 10 times the disaster of the 2003 Iraq invasion. So John Mearsheimer is another intellectual who I greatly respect, and so that I find that a provocative thought. So on that basis, I'd have to say that Joe Biden is the worst president in the past century for this unnecessary conflict in Ukraine. And then after that, I'd have to say that George W. Bush was just a terrible president for the unnecessary invasion and occupation of Afghanistan and Iraq. Barack Obama didn't do that much. I mean, he was a bad president because he inspired Black Lives Matter and kind of a collapse in law enforcement during his final term. So he was a disaster. The first Trump administration overall I thought was good. I liked how he restricted immigration. He changed our trade policies. He pivoted to combating China. And I love the start that the second Trump administration has made. And Christopher Caldwell says the most significant thing that Trump has done are the series of executive orders doing away with affirmative action. I think that's just fantastic.
Yeah, he really has gone in there and taken that apart. By the way, 40, how do you stream so much? My God, you're really a phenomenon here.
Well, part of it's very energy dependent, so I have to feel energized about what I'm talking about. And so when Trump got raided by the FBI and then charged with those felonies, that was kind of energizing. I was sort of done with Trump by that point. I didn't really have any enthusiasm until the FBI raided Mar-a-Lago, and then they charged him with crimes in New York City, and then they launched 4 different criminal prosecutions of him, and then suddenly I got back on the Trump train, and I just found it energizing.
Yeah, I think we kind of got back on the same page at that point. But yeah, I do listen to your show a lot, by the way. So, but I can hardly keep up with the content. I mean, you're putting out like 3 hours a day, man, which is great.
Yeah, well, sometimes, I mean, there were a year ago at this time, I was producing 1 show a week, if that. Sometimes I'd go 2-3 weeks without producing anything, and that was valuable too. Because I absolutely believe that there are times that I should just stop talking, like go live life, go make money, write down some notes, rethink everything. So I wanted to talk to you about depression because you've written a book review on a book on depression, and I take an evolutionary lens on much of life, and I think depression has a profoundly adaptive role to play in that depression and illness, they inhibit you from doing the things that you habitually do. Therefore, you get an opportunity to rethink all the things that you put energy into. So for me, live streaming, I put a lot of energy into this, and it's really important for me to stop it at times and rethink it. And is this a good direction of my energy? So illness and depression, humiliation, just leads to contemplation. Like, is this a good use of my time, of my effort? So whenever I get sick or I get depressed, then it's an opportunity to just rethink everything that I am doing, and then plotting some changes in direction going forward, and then thinking through in my mind how those changes of direction are likely to work out, and then adjust them. Maybe don't change in some ways, change more radically in other ways, change differently in this way. You get an opportunity to think things through before you exert yourself again. And so that opportunity to just reset your system, rethink everything that you've been giving yourself to is I think, a wonderfully adaptive use of both depression, illness, humiliation, and failure. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, that's well said. Absolutely. I think that could be plausibly an evolutionary function of depression. And you mentioned that book. The book is written by Eric Meisel. You can find some stuff of him on YouTube. And basically, his thesis is that he's kind of anti-medication. I don't necessarily agree with that, but it's you kind of get that vibe. But he's not against it necessarily. But he believes that depression is an existential problem, that you lack a purpose and a meaning to your life, and therefore you need to clarify that, and that helps by very explicitly stating what is your life mission, what is your life purpose, and you can write it out. So I find it interesting, but when people reject the kind of the chemical component of that, I'm not sure that I agree with that necessarily. It's kind of a right-wing thing to say, look at all the antidepressants. I don't know. I mean, if someone wants to take antidepressants, then let them. Who cares? I mean, maybe it helps. So
now, what's your experience of illness? So if I'm so ill, for example, that I can't work, it's just a shattering experience. Like, I hate being sick, and like I'm just reduced to lying on the floor groaning sometimes, and it's a shattering. It just causes me to rethink and revalue everything. I'm just curious, what's your existential experience with illness? Like, for me, illness, particularly if it lasts for a few days, it inevitably leads into a low level of depression for a few days further.
Yeah. I've been pretty healthy the last few years. I think however, I do kind of relate to your experience in some ways, because I think a lot of illness is like self-attacking. It's like it's so mental, it's so psychological a lot of the times. I mean, if you have the flu, you have the flu, and you know it because you have a temperature. There's an objective number, 100. Like, you're not imagining it, but like I had the idea I was allergic to milk and gluten, and then I was in a relationship, and my girlfriend at the time made some pasta, and I just ate it, and I said, "Oh wait, this has wheat in it, and I'm eating it, and there's no problem." So I think at least for me, my attitude is like, you got to just get up and go. If you feel bad, drink a cup of coffee, and maybe tomorrow you'll feel better. So
no, but I'm talking about the existential component of illness. So when you're so sick that you cannot get up and go, all right, all you can do is lie there. You're too sick even to watch TV, watch movies, listen to anything. You're just that sick. For me, it's shattering, and I rethink all my efforts,
right.
Everything that I devote myself to. I just rethink every commitment I have in my life, because even when we pass through the acute phase of that level of illness, I do have diminished energy and strength for a few days longer, and so I have to reevaluate my priorities. So do you have that experience of illness, that existential rethinking experience?
I don't really get that sick like that. The last time I felt like that was when I got the COVID vaccine. But even when I'm sick, or if I have the flu or the cold, I'm still kind of productive. I'm like, okay, maybe I need another half hour sleep and a little bit of hazelnut in my coffee, and I feel good. I feel okay. So
when you had a bad reaction to the COVID vaccine, I mean, that usually only lasts 24 hours. How long did it last for you? Oh, so that's nothing.
It was like,
when was the last time that you were so sick that you couldn't leave the house for days on end?
Never. I can't remember that.
Wow.
That's a 40 problem.
Yeah.
But you're very eloquent in describing that, that your chronic fatigue syndrome, and I'm sure that it helps a lot of people to hear about that.
But what about humiliation, right? You get humiliated like everybody else, and humiliation, if it's substantial enough, it's similarly experienced by me, at least, as an existential crisis, making me rethink everything and where I put my energy and my efforts. So how do you experience humiliation as a reset, as a rethink?
Yeah, I agree. It's a rethink. I mean, without getting specific, I've been fired from jobs like you have and like everybody has, and you kind of go back and you say, well, maybe I was a little too aggressive there, or I should have been more of a team player here. And yeah, you rethink, but but that's the beauty of I don't know. I'm happy with what I'm doing right now, and so there's nobody to humiliate me. I'm just kind of like, I'm making my shorts on YouTube, and you speak for 3 hours, I speak for 1 minute, and that's probably why it hurts me to listen to my appearance on your show, because I can't edit out all the ums and the pauses, so I'm not used to that.
How do you deal with the randomness of life and the vulnerability of life? So your best friend might get hit by a drunk driver. You might be in a plane where the pilot, makes a really terrible landing. The sense of vulnerability, is this something you just don't think about? How do you handle the inherent vulnerability and randomness of life?
I guess you can put me in the camp of I don't think about it. I'm a pretty careful person, though, I will say. So I do my utmost to avoid those kind of calamities, and I'm not really anxious about things that might happen, I guess. So I know, Ford, I'm not good at answering your philosophical questions. I'm not like you. I'm different. I think we're different because I'm kind of more into, I don't know, what, tangible, how would you describe it?
You're more of a practical man.
Yeah, I am. But as I said, I love to. I have great intellectual needs, as do you. So I guess we connect on that level.
How do you like living in Texas?
Well, I will say that it was very affordable when I first moved here. However, the price of living has risen quite a bit. But it's, I live in Dallas, so the stereotype that people have about Texas, it's like, Dallas is very diverse, and I don't really relate to Texans in particular. So I'm just kind of here. I'm just like an atomized individual that happens to be in Dallas. But
okay, so you don't have a strong Texas forever identity.
Not even, no.
You probably didn't even watch Friday Night Lights.
No, what is that?
You didn't watch Friday Night Lights, mate?
No.
Oh, fantastic book, number one. Fantastic movie, number two. Fantastic TV series, number three, about wholesome Friday Night Lights football, high school football in Texas, in Odessa, Texas. Just,
okay.
Where God's people live.
Right. Yeah, no, I'm just an urbanite who is happened. It's just the Northeast. It's like, where are you going to go? I mean, if you're not really racking in the cash, you're not going to live in New York City. So, what are you going to live in the suburbs of New York City? So, to me, it just seemed like a good move just to move to another city in another part.
Did you watch that movie about a New York writer is being called back to Texas by someone that he slept with once? It came out like last year. Doggone it. New York writer called back to Texas movie. You know what I'm talking about?
No. But
Vengeance. Right.
Okay.
Ben, journalist from New York City, travels to Texas to attend the funeral of a girl he hooked up with.
I feel like I heard you talk about that, or someone talk about that.
Yeah, I talked about it. I thought it was a killer film, Vengeance.
Okay.
But no, you didn't see that. You didn't hear about that.
So anyway, so 40. I think I had a better. I think I had a better appearance tonight. I gave you more time. Did I do it justice?
Yes. You met the needs of the American public, bro. You're a true patriot.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I hope the audience is not offended by my appearance.
Well, screw them, even if they were.
Yeah. No, I mean, I like it when you have guests on. So if I can be mildly entertaining, then I guess I did my job. Or maybe
okay, bro. Good to talk to you. Take care, man.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye. Okay. I'll play a little bit more here from Jesse Waters as I get my bearings.
People are this paranoid, it tells me they're hiding something. It's like when a cop knocks on a drug dealer's den and hears everybody inside running and barricading themselves in and flushing drugs down the toilet. DOGE has a warrant, and they're going in. Staff at the GSA are tweaking so hard, they're not taking their work phones home because they think Big Balls is snooping on their calls. One says this: there is a persistent feeling that we are being watched. The government's watching you, but they don't like it when you watch the government. Big Brother's getting Big Brothered. Congress has the power of the purse and is supposed to have oversight of the federal government, but Congress spent us into a $36 trillion snake pit and never found an ounce of fraud. So guess where Congress is now? They're on vacation. Congress said this was a constitutional crisis and then took a week off. The politicians tapped out and they sent in the drag queens.
Darlings, oh my gosh, here I am at the protest of 5051. It is so exciting to be down here with so many people fighting the good fight and doing the good things, darlings. We have to get to the streets, make our voices heard, and don't forget, darlings, while you're doing it, stay gorgeous.
Drag queens are Democrats' first line of defense. They're the first ones off the bench. Get in there, Sparkle. Up in Boston, there was a lot of singing. The Boston Tea Party, it was not. But if you think all they have is drag queens and cowbells, you're wrong. They're planning a protest outside of Tesla dealerships. And if they already own a Tesla, they're slapping on anti-Elon bumper stickers. Look at this one. I bought this before we knew Elon was crazy. Elon says they're crazy.
They call it like Trump derangement syndrome. And I don't, you don't realize how real this is until you can't reason with people. So I was at a friend's birthday party in LA, just a birthday dinner, and it was like a nice, quiet dinner, and everyone was behaving normally. And then I happened to meet.
Okay, so the beginning part of today's Commentary Magazine podcast is important. Also, Alex Castellanos last night at Mark Halperin's show made some important points.
In terms of DOGE right now, or worries you?
I will offer a different point of view than perhaps is expected. I am not bothered by the lack of transparency. I think they are moving so fast. Frankly, I'm surprised they're as transparent as they are. If anything, I worry they will not be able to keep up this speed. And there is no alternative. The alternative to doing things this fast is failure. It's to get mired back in the swamp, in the quicksand, and not succeeding. And DOGE ultimately will not be judged if, a cruel way to say it, if they break some eggs, if they cause trauma, if they hurt people. Ultimately, DOGE and Trump will be judged only if they are successful. If they, right now, the U.S. government is this country is trying to pedal a bicycle into the future, dragging a boat, and the boat's going the other way. And we have this weight. And if we can unshackle ourselves from that and open up this economy, imagine that money not being taken out of the productive economy to fund unnecessary government expenditures. Imagine that it's there for people to innovate and create with at a time in history where we are doing transformational technological things and moving into a new era. Holy smokes. What a time to water the garden and see what grows here. If Trump is, I think Trump and DOGE are being judged many times as if we were still living in the old world of neither side, Republican or Democrat, is effective at anything, at least in a positive way. And so we look at the political consequence and judge things on that. No, you don't have the dominant media anymore to destroy an administration, rightly or wrongly. You have a fragmented world. You don't have swing voters being the determinative voters. You have a political realignment now where black voters, young voters, even women, Hispanics are moving in a different direction. And you're talking to them through social media, the channels that will protect this movement. So my concern is that it's like the war in Israel. And if you don't do it quickly, you can't do it at all. We have no patience for this as a country. And my fear is that Democrats will be effective at really stopping a transformational movement to modernize our government. If we invented government today, would it look anything like what we have now? And the answer is no. Let's take a shot at that. That's what I think Trump is trying to do.
Congressman, what do you like about DOGE?
Well, if I feel like those are some phenomenal points there by Alex Castellanos. He brings it. All right, on every Halperin appearance, I just love what he does. And the commentary crew had some killer points this morning.
Strengthen the nuclear arsenal of the West. They would move the clock hand closer to midnight because we were, of course, making things more dangerous, not the Soviets. So that was
level
kind of
midnight, as office fans would call it.
Yeah, so that was like a foundational example of the ideological capture of something where it's like, we are nuclear scientists. We can do things you don't even understand. And then what those people had to say about, this is sort of an issue in the movie Oppenheimer, what they actually had to say about geopolitics. What do they know about geopolitics? They know how to split an atom, and that's pretty impressive. But what they know about deterrence or international treaty organizations or anything like that is no more and no less, and probably far less than a lot of other people.
But this is actually a good example of something we're in the midst of now in Washington, with Elon Musk and other tech bros coming in and trading on the credibility of their tech companies or space companies or whatever they run to assume that they have the ability to change federal government, which is itself a very different beast. So I see trading on the credibility of one's either one's membership in the case of medical organizations, or trading on the credibility of one's successes in the private sector. And I would certainly say Elon Musk in particular has had massive success in the private sector. But assuming those skills transfer, I think we're learning some tough lessons about that right now.
My favorite thing from the AAP, the American Academy of Pediatrics, was during COVID, all this was when they really sort of lost their minds. And I remember very clearly, and I pulled it up just to just to make sure I wasn't misremembering that they very, very clearly said that if you wear a mask, cover your face, it does not harm children's ability to pick up language cues from you, from adults, from parents, and that there is no evidence that it does. And that was the moment I think a lot of people were like, okay, 2 + 2 = 4. No matter what the AAP says, the sky is blue or looks blue. That's actually probably something that, I don't want Neil deGrasse Tyson to jump in here and say, actually, but the obvious things that we see in front of us, right? Of course, it makes a difference to a young child's ability to learn language to not see your face. Like, it's almost ridiculous to even ask the question. And the AAP sort of marshaled this they ignored like all this other evidence and said like, nothing we reviewed. It's like, well, you didn't review everything. And that was a sort of teachers union. Yeah, right, exactly. That was a sort of moment where it's like, are these people serious?
Well, let's put the two together, because of course the screens are the ultimate example of the incredible hypocrisy and political double dealing of the American Academy of Pediatrics, which had made a fetish of this idea that screens are bad for children. Of course, there is now a lot of evidence, and not just of like small children, but of teenagers, right? That the engagement with the phone and the screen has had a net negative effect on depression, on social abilities, and all of that. So in a weird way, television, which is not an interactive medium, right, is a passive medium, it turns out maybe not so bad compared to screens, right? Compared to interactive screens, which are engaging the dopamine, the sort of the dopamine rush they can create and all of that, and then the withdrawal of the dopamine and this world of total exposure at all times. Then COVID comes along, and the idea is that are we going to close schools and teach kids on screens? And suddenly screens are just fine. Screens are great. Screens are what's wrong with screens? After 20 years of like making everybody in the country feel bad if they like park their kid in front of an episode of Teletubbies or Bluey or something like that because they needed a break. Suddenly that's not okay for 2 decades, and then suddenly it's okay for a kid to be on a screen for 8 hours rather than being in school. That's where I think everything broke down. It was like the pediatrics version of you can't go outside unless there's a demonstration against George Floyd. Then you could go outside. That's not going to spread COVID. Everything else would spread COVID, but not if you need to do a social justice demonstration. That, I think, is where the gaslighting of the social justice warriors actually, where things really did bifurcate in June 2020 and with the school stuff. Like, if people understood there was a crisis in March of 2020 when everything shut down and that something was going to have to be done. We didn't know what was safe. We didn't know if COVID was on surfaces or was airborne. We didn't know anything. And so if you needed to shut schools down and figure out some jury-rigged solution until the end of the school year, maybe that was understandable. It was the question of what happened when we got through the summer and we knew that kids weren't dying from COVID or getting COVID. We knew that the death toll was already in the hundreds of thousands and that there were 400 people between the ages of 0 and 18 who had died in the United States, that COVID was not dangerous to kids. And then it turned out that wasn't even the claim. The claim wasn't that the kids were going to get it. It was that the teachers were going to get it or that the administrators were going to get it. And then suddenly the purpose of education in the United States was no longer the education of kids, but the employment of adults. Well, and that became just sort of like a total, just seamless transition to the idea that who needed to be protected from COVID was adults in schools.
Well, and in real time, we had these examples of private schools in particular coming back into the classroom and finding ways to do that safely, both for the students and for the teachers and administrators, because their commitment was to the kids. And we saw that in states like Florida and other states that opened up. And so the fact that the AAP and, of course, the teachers unions and Biden administration were sticking to their guns on these draconian measures suggests that the ideological need to control a population to suit the organizations and groups most allied with the Democratic Party, which are the teachers unions, and the fact that the AAP went on board with that, they chose their allies unwisely. And I think it's another example of something we talked about when we were in the midst of the COVID nightmare, which was where will the long tail effects be seen? And I think mistrust in medical and public health institutions, that's going to continue for a long time. I am unconvinced RFK can restore our trust, but,
as well.
But there it is.
But RFK would not be the Health and Human Services Secretary in the world before COVID. I mean, it just wouldn't have happened. The fact that you could have this incredibly unconventional representative of things we would generally think of as quackery, tort promoting health nonsense and all of that, can take over the health apparatus of the United States. That's only made possible by the misbehavior of the health apparatus of the United States, which has no which had no moral suasion, to argue that he could not be put in charge because they had mishandled everything so much.
Yeah, I was going to say another long tail is the state of the education of kids now. That's not recovered by a long shot. And the other thing is that because so many different sectors and parties got on board with this, they can just, each one can say, well, it wasn't me. It was the AAP. Well, it wasn't me. It was the teacher. It wasn't me. It was the government. It was, I was just following this, and then you have no accountability.
Right, but it's not only you have no accountability. Then it's like, well, then everybody is the villain.
Right.
Then you're telling me that this was a giant mindset that spread its blanket across the country.
And they try to make that argument. They use the universal we. When they talk about, when we say keeping kids out of school is bad, people said that from the beginning, but now it's obviously the case. They'll say, well, we didn't know a lot about the virus at first. We didn't know a lot about how it spread. We didn't have a lot of experience treating the virus or taking preventative actions. We hadn't, had a war here, which is usually when kids are out of school for long periods of time, right? And you can study the effects. Like in Europe, you have these pockets where, they know what the effects that losing education had because they had a war. We haven't had the conditions that keep kids out of school for long periods. It bypassed the idea that you can know information, right? Like school is good for kids and therefore no school is not good for kids. It seems like an obvious, logical, leap. I don't think I'm making a huge leap by saying we know education is good and therefore taking education away from our children is bad, or the social environments and things like that. But it was like, that's how they do that. That's how they make sure that no individual gets, gets caught on.
So David Frum in The Atlantic has a thoughtful essay, Why the COVID Deniers Won. Let's play some of this.
Why the COVID Deniers Won. Lessons from the pandemic and its aftermath. Written by David Frum for The Atlantic. Narrated by LJ Ganser for Apple News Plus subscribers. 5 years ago, the coronavirus pandemic struck a bitterly divided society. Americans first diverged over how dangerous the disease was. Just a flu, as President Donald Trump repeatedly insisted, or something much deadlier. Then they disputed public health measures, such as lockdowns and masking. A majority complied, while a passionate minority fiercely resisted. Finally, they split, and have remained split, over the value and safety of COVID-19 vaccines. Anti-vaccine beliefs started on the fringe, but they spread to the point where Ron DeSantis, the governor of the country's third most populous state, launched a campaign for president on an appeal to anti-vaccine ideology. 5 years later, one side has seemingly triumphed. The winner is not the side that initially prevailed, the side of public safety. The winner is the side that minimized the disease, then rejected public health measures to prevent its spread, and finally refused the vaccines designed to protect against its worst effects. Ahead of COVID's 5th anniversary, Trump, as president-elect, nominated the country's most outspoken vaccination opponent to head the Department of Health and Human Services. He chose a proponent of the debunked and discredited vaccines cause autism claim to lead the CDC. He named a strident critic of COVID vaccine mandates to lead the FDA. For Surgeon General, he picked a believer in hydroxychloroquine, the disproven COVID-19 remedy. His pick for director of the National Institutes of Health had advocated for letting COVID spread unchecked to encourage herd immunity. Despite having fast-tracked the development of the vaccines as president, Trump has himself trafficked in many forms of COVID-19 denial and has expressed his own suspicions that childhood vaccination against measles and mumps is a cause of autism. The ascendancy of the anti-vaxxers may ultimately prove fleeting. But if the forces of science and health are to stage a comeback, it's important to understand why those forces have gone into eclipse. From March 2020 to February 2022, about 1 million Americans died of COVID-19. Many of those deaths occurred after vaccines became available. If every adult in the United States had received 2 doses of a COVID vaccine by early 2022, rather than just the 64% of adults who had, nearly 320,000 lives would have been saved. Why did so many Americans resist vaccines? Perhaps the biggest reason was that the pandemic coincided with a presidential election year, and Trump instantly recognized the crisis as a threat to his chances for re-election. He responded by denying the seriousness of the pandemic, promising that the disease would rapidly disappear on its own, and promoting quack cures. The COVID-19 vaccines were developed while Trump was president. They could have been advertised as a Trump achievement, but by the time they became widely available, Trump was out of office. His supporters had already made up their minds to distrust the public health authorities that promoted the vaccines. Now, they had an additional incentive. Any benefit from vaccination would redound to Trump's successor, Joe Biden. Vaccine rejection became a badge of group loyalty, one that ultimately cost many lives. A summer 2023 study by Yale researchers of voters in Florida and Ohio found that during the early phase of the pandemic, self-identified Republicans died at only a slightly higher rate than self-identified Democrats in the same age range. But once vaccines were introduced, Republicans became much more likely to die than Democrats. In the spring of 2021, the excess death rate among Florida and Ohio Republicans was 43% higher than among Florida and Ohio Democrats in the same age range. By the late winter of 2023, the 300-odd most pro-Trump counties in the country had a COVID-19 death rate more than 2.5 times higher than the 300 or so most anti-Trump counties. In 2016, Trump had boasted that he could shoot a man on Fifth Avenue and not lose any votes. In 2021 and 2022, his most fervent supporters risked death to prove their loyalty to Trump and his cause. Why did political fidelity express itself in such self-harming ways? The onset of the pandemic was an unusually confusing and disorienting event. Some people who got COVID died. Others lived. Some suffered only mild symptoms. Others spent weeks on ventilators or emerged with long COVID and never fully recovered. Some lost businesses built over a lifetime. Others refinanced their homes with 2% interest rates and banked the savings. We live in an impersonal universe, indifferent to our hopes and wishes, subject to extreme randomness. We don't like this at all. We crave satisfying explanations. We want to believe that somebody is in control, even if it's somebody we don't like. At least that way, we can blame bad events on bad people. This is the eternal appeal of conspiracy theories. How did this happen? Somebody must have done it, but who? And why? Compounding the disorientation, the coronavirus outbreak was a rapidly changing story. The scientists who researched COVID-19 knew more in April 2020 than they did in February. More in August than in April. More in 2021 than in 2020. More in 2022 than in 2021. The official advice kept changing. Stay inside. No. Go outside. Wash your hands. No. Mask your face. Some Americans appreciated and accepted that knowledge improves over time, that more will be known about a new disease in month 2 than in month 1. But not all Americans saw the world that way. They mistrusted the idea of knowledge as a developing process. Such Americans wondered, were they lying before, or are they lying now? In a different era, Americans might have deferred more to medical authority. The internet has upended old ideas of what should count as authority and who possesses it. The pandemic reduced normal human interactions. Severed from one another, Americans deepened their parasocial attachment to social media platforms, which foment alienation and rage. Hundreds of thousands of people plunged into an alternate mental universe during COVID-19 lockdowns. When their doors reopened, the mania did not recede. Conspiracies and mistrust of the establishment, never strangers to the American mind, have been nourished, and they grew. The experts themselves contributed to this loss of trust. It's now agreed that we had little to fear from going outside in dispersed groups, but that was not the state of knowledge in the spring of 2020. At the time, medical experts insisted that any kind of mass outdoor event must be sacrificed to the imperatives of the emergency. In mid-March 2020, federal public health authorities shut down some of Florida's beaches. In California, surfers faced heavy fines for venturing into the ocean. Even the COVID-skeptical Trump White House reluctantly canceled the April 2020 Easter egg roll. And then the experts abruptly reversed themselves. When George Floyd was choked to death by a Minneapolis police officer on May 25, 2020, hundreds of thousands of Americans left their homes to protest, defying 3 months of urgings to avoid large gatherings of all kinds, outdoor as well as indoor. On May 29th, the American Public Health Association issued a statement that proclaimed racism a public health crisis, while conspicuously refusing to condemn the sudden defiance of public safety rules. The next few weeks saw the largest mass protests in recent U.S. history. Approximately 15 million to 26 million people attended outdoor Black Lives Matter events in June 2020, according to a series of reputable polls. Few, if any, scientists or doctors scolded the attendees, and many politicians joined the protests, including future Vice President Kamala Harris. It all raised a suspicion. Maybe the authorities were making the rules based on politics, not science. The politicization of health advice became even more consequential as the summer of 2020 ended. Most American public schools had closed in March. At their peak, Education Week reported the closures affected at least 55.1 million students in 124,000 U.S. public and private schools. By September, it was already apparent that COVID-19 posed relatively little risk to children and teenagers, and that remote learning did not work. At the same time, returning to the classroom before vaccines were available could pose some risk to teachers' health, and possibly also to the health of the adults to whom the children returned after school. How to balance these concerns, given the imperfect information? Liberal states decided in favor of the teachers. In California, the majority of students did not return to in-person learning until the fall of 2021. New Jersey kept many of its public schools closed until then as well. Similar things happened in many other states: Illinois, Maryland, New York, and so on.
Okay, good article there by David Frum in The Atlantic. So I was seeing chat conversation about how Hugh Hefner could only do certain sexual positions with young women. I remember I was dating this gorgeous woman in 2003, and I'm so trad. All right, I mean, I kissed her on the first date, but I kept dating her for 3 weeks, I think, before one evening, right, it came time for the ultimate deed. And she was saying, oh, you got to, treat me with care. You got to, be really sweet to me. And, I'm going at it. And then I thought, oh, I got a great idea. Let's do a different position. And so why did I have this great idea of switching from me being on top to trying a different position? Because so many women have told me, like, oh, I really appreciate you, 40, for having such a small penis, because that way we can do more positions. Like my previous boyfriend, he had a really big schlong, and it just limited what we could do. So I am just so grateful that I get to be with a guy with a small penis. So I thought, okay, I got a small penis, let's take advantage, and let's do a different position. And so I said, why don't you go on top? And then she goes on top. So this is 2003. I am, oh boy, I'm 37 years of age, and she's gorgeous, right? Absolutely gorgeous. But I lost it. I lost my erection. And she said, wow, that's never happened to me before. I mean, she was a gorgeous young woman. But yeah, I think it's a sign of lack of cardiovascular health. I mean, after about age 37, unless I was in a particularly heightened state, all right, I couldn't really keep it going with the woman on top anymore. And I needed you to know this. I need you to understand this about me. It's your fault that you brought this topic up. I'm the victim here. But I'm not the type of guy to mine personal conversations. But I was talking to someone, he said, 40, you agree with 96% of Steve Saylor's tweets and 95% of Mark Halperin. Those are the dudes whose thinking most closely tracks your own. But for me, it's Walter Kirn, right? He tries to look past the information given. He tries to pay attention to the methods used to nudge the herd in certain directions, right? Steve Bannon, another person whose thinking I'm usually nodding in agreement with. So why don't you pry yourself away from Mark Halperin and John Podhoretz and start listening to some Walter Kirn? And so I said, mate, I agree with Steve Saylor 99.999% of the time. I can't even think of anything I disagree with him about. I agree with Mark Halperin probably about 60-70% of the time. I agree with Charles Murray 93.8% of the time. I mean, Walter Kirn and Matt Taibi are entertaining, but they're not rigorous thinkers like Steve Saylor or Christopher Caldwell or Charles Murray. And I appreciate my friends who stand on their own 2 feet. So some people say, oh, 40, if you just spent a few hours like listening to these particular videos, or if you just read this book, you would learn to see things the way I see them. And I don't have that, right? I don't think, oh, if you just watch more of my shows, if you just read my blog posts, you'll change your mind on this heartfelt issue, right? You have different genetics than I do. You have different childhood experiences, and you live in a different set of incentives than I do. So it never occurs to me that if someone only consumes X content, that then finally they'll change their mind. It's not how I think, but I'm an open-minded guy. Like, I'll try new things. Because I'm not big, like, I can do more positions, guys. And so,
all right,
Walter
welcome
Kirn,
to America This Week.
Matt Taibbi,
Free
I'll
World,
give it a
I
shot.
guess, or formerly Free World. But
It too is a polymicrobial infection.
Yeah. So just to back up a little bit, before last Friday, there was obviously a great deal of back and forth and controversy, and you and I have talked about this topic many times on this show. We've also talked about the idea that the possibility of the United States being folded into the gradually tightening censorship and security apparatus that is already formally in place in Europe was a major issue last year during the campaign. I think for a lot of people it was for me. But JD Vance, the vice president, was really the first major politician to bring up censorship on the campaign trail. It was a kind of a non-issue in 2020, and he brought it up this summer. And then he went to Europe, and on Friday at the Munich Security Conference, in front of a bunch of officials, European officials, who were expecting to hear about, how many more billions of dollars we're going to send to Ukraine, suddenly he just got bitch slapped in this 19-minute broadside of a speech. And let's just watch a little bit of it. This is a tiny excerpt. We can just watch maybe a minute just to get the feel.
Right, there was someone I'm close to in Australia who said, "Oh, you got to watch this speech," but it's so much easier to just read a speech transcript.
C.J. Hopkins for using a very faint swastika on his on his book cover in a way that was meant to imply that the health authorities were acting like Nazis. He was using it satirically. He was convicted of an American citizen was convicted of a hate speech offense. So he does all this stuff and basically tells Europe at the end of it, the meat of this whole thing is, if you're going to continue doing this, there's nothing America can do for you, which is, he called it an offer, but it sounded more like an ultimatum. Like, if you don't stop this shit, we're going to, the money's going to be turned off, or, well, that's a complicated equation because Europe buys a lot of American debt, but still, it sounded like the end of our support for this stuff. And there was a shocked reaction, and we'll get to what happened, but yeah.
And may I also add that he mentioned the Romanian election that was canceled, nullified, because supposedly there had been Putin-esque influence on it through social media.
One of the most unbelievable stories that just has been smoothed over.
Smoothed over. I mean, it really is in some ways the Nord Stream pipeline of electoral stories. We just blew it up.
Right.
Except this time there was no being cute about who'd done it. They did it in broad daylight, and for the flimsiest of reasons. Because of course, it doesn't take John le Carre to tell you that you can spoof Russian influence in any election, and then if you don't like the result, you can use it as the pretext to cancel the election in some places now. I mean, we've actually had history of that in the United States. We had a Senate election in Alabama in which Russian influence was spoofed to besmirch one of the candidates.
Roy Moore. Yep. Mm-hmm.
So we've now taken a kind of censorship that is based on words and so on to a new level, a censorship of elections, of the very voice of the people, Vox Populi has expressed through elections. So if anybody thinks that this run of examples that Vance gave, and including the one that I just mentioned, isn't a comprehensive picture of total control, they aren't using basic political imagination. It is very unclear what the rules in Europe are at this point, what the boundaries are, and what the limits are to the powers that they are just rapidly aggregating to themselves with very little legal basis, as far as I'm concerned, or historic basis.
Yeah, we should actually just show.
So my friend is a live streamer, and his life was totally transformed in June of 2022, I think, when he started taking grass-fed beef organ capsules from ancestral supplements. And then the other day he was feeling quite low testosterone. So I rarely have lustful thoughts, all right, and the physiological manifestations of lustful thoughts. And I was thinking, maybe I'm just an ascended spiritual being. Maybe I've just transcended the normal lusts and concerns and desires that torment normal people. Maybe I'm just low T. And so, of course, I go on Amazon, and thanks to Amazon's AI program, they recommend male optimizer. This is my friend who was experiencing all this. And so my friend, he went on Amazon, and they recommended male optimization mofo. It's like, whoa, this sounds like a great source of vitality. So my friend's a live streamer. At the time, he was live streaming like 6 days a week, probably about 12 hours a week. Well, he went on Ancestral Supplements website, and he bought some male optimization mofo. And then after he bought it, they said, if you order in the next 10 minutes, we will throw in some grass-fed beef tallow at 25% off. So my friend was like, grass-fed beef tallow from New Zealand cows at 25% off? Hell yeah! So he clicked, and my friend bought grass-fed beef tallow. And then they popped another window. They said, if you order our grass-fed beef liver from New Zealand cows in the next 10 minutes, we will give this to you at 25% off. And my friend said, hell yeah! I'm getting me some grass-fed beef liver, Ancestral Supplements, New Zealand cows. And then it's like, he was stoked, man. It's like if 6 beef organ capsules, like, it just completely transformed his life. What the hell would happen after he gets these three bottles of male optimization mofo, and he's preparing to return to his prayers. And then Ancestral Supplement says, if you order in the next 10 minutes, we'll give you ancestral minerals at 25% off. And my friend, he couldn't help it. He said, okay, heck yeah, I'm getting that. And so the supplements arrived for my friend about 3 weeks ago, right about the time that Donald Trump took office. And my friend is just unbelievably male optimized ever since then. He is just live streaming for hours at a time. He has strength, he has energy, he has enthusiasm, like the physiology, the spirituality, it's all working together. He can talk for hours, he can walk and talk. Like, my friend is able to, like, work out in ways that he wasn't able to work out. Like, he's gone from, like, certain exercises that he was just doing 20 repetitions of, now he's doing 30, and he's doing, extra numbers of sets. And my friend, like, he gets a little bit sore in the back left shoulder blade, but then my friend's got this massage gun, and so yeah, he's been working out a lot more since he got the supplements. And then he finds if he just works that, right there, boy, it makes you feel dizzy when you work that. Do not put this on your neck, whatever you do, but just there, and then just reach it up under the shoulder blade there. And my friend was so stoked. He was able to undo, right, the sore left under the shoulder blades feeling from just dramatically boosting his workout due to this plethora of supplements from Ancestral Supplements. And he is just feeling great. I mean, he thought he couldn't feel any better after just 6 beef organ capsules. But now he's got his beef tallow. He's got his bloody male optimization mofo. He's got ancestral minerals. He's got his bloody beef liver. And who can forget the bloody beef tallow? And he's got his massage gun. So if he works out too much and starts, straining some muscles, right? That's the thing, as you get older. My friend's in his late 50s, and so now when he dramatically increases his workout, he's very likely to get some sore muscles. But he just bloody takes his good old Bob and Brad. I love Bob and Brad. You watch the Bob and Brad physical therapy videos on YouTube, and then you got to get in there with the old activator. Just find you got to find those tense, tight muscles after you really overdo it with the weights and the push-ups and the pull-ups. And now my friend, he likes to do his push-ups and pull-ups on a tree branch. And the Sheilas, they're just walking by. They got big smiles on their faces, like mad respect as he's just hanging from that tree branch and just pumping through his repetitions of the pull-ups. I mean, my friend has just discovered a whole new self, a whole new layer of strength and vitality and enthusiasm. His live streams going longer and longer, like all parts, all sorts of parts of his life are just getting longer and longer and longer. Unbelievable, man. All he needed was some beef tallow and beef liver and optimization mofo. It's just completely transformed his life. So you guys, I see you've got your idea deflection shields on, so very important. Always keep your idea deflection shields on, right? You don't want to learn anything, do you? No, God forbid that you should learn something. God forbid that you should try something, right? God forbid that you should absorb a different perspective on things. So yeah, please keep your idea deflection shields up very high. It's an absolutely essential technique for under-earning, right? You want to stay in your cave, right? You want to keep a very small life. You want to keep living in poverty so that you are not bewildered by all the options that you'll have to deal with once you graduate from the poverty mindset. So please hang on to your idea deflection shield, right? Just make sure that people can't offer you any ideas that could improve the quality of your life, help you earn more money. Just keep up that idea deflection shield. Okay. Yeah, that Bob and Brad, one of them did have a stroke. Absolutely. Trump would be broken by corn pop were it not for the power of beef pills. You're getting more tense trying to fix attention. Bro, do I look like a tense man? And because I'm not huge, like, we can do more positions on this show. Do deaths affect Luke, or does he simply drop all his beliefs and relax? Well, I got to admit that for a lot of people I've known who died, the primary thing I felt afterwards was relief. So I may have a little bit of emotional disconnection. So there may be something a little broken with me, right? I don't end conversations like a normal person, but I am not filled with tension, bro. What a thing to say, unnecessary tension. What a thing to say to America's greatest Alexander technique teacher. Man, those beef fills. I feel this was not just a victory for Luke. Look, it was one small step for my friend. It was one giant leap for mankind. Okay, so I'm not the type of person to mine personal conversations for content. I mean, I'm not going to intrude in that territory. But someone did have a thoughtful observation. Look, you're a seeker of self-help promises and endless betterment. You're an alien. You ape human interactions as best you can. This is too painfully true. There's an emotional disconnect somewhere along your lines. Not judging, just observing. You don't feel emotions from others, or you don't process them correctly. Right? I hear you disconnecting with Duvid and Clair. Is this for the sake of the show, or is this simply because 40 is aloof? 40 is unable to be more tactful. Like, where the hell is 40 so broken? And it's the mother factor, bro. Right? People who grow up without a mother, right, tend to be emotionally disconnected and emotionally retarded, like me. Bye-bye.